by the story, because I should tell you that the story is very similar. For example, you remember perhaps that when the flood is at its full force and everyone is in the ark, that when the waters stop, when the rains stop, Noah wants to find out, for example, where they are. So he opens a window and a bird is released, and the bird comes back because there's nowhere to settle, and he does it twice. And the third time, the dove finds one of the trees which has appeared above the water and makes a nest and doesn't return. So he knows that the waters are going down. Well, this also occurs in the Assyrian tablet. It's not just a vague similarity, it's a textual dependence one to the other. So this was a very hard thing to digest. And then they realized that the actual boat described there, well, a cube, absolutely nothing to do with the Bible. I mean, a cube, who could have a cubic boat? We don't have to worry anymore. This is fine. It's just coincidence. Because everybody knows what the boat looks like in the book of Genesis. It's very lucky, you can do research these days with this thing called Google. So I Googled Noah's Ark, and here is a contemporary photograph, apparently, of Noah's Ark, which tells you exactly what it looked like on the basis of the Hebrew inscription. So this is the situation. At the end of the 19th century, there were people who knew their Bible who expected the ark to be coffin-shaped. And there were people who were interested in Assyriology who thought it ought to be cube-shaped. And of course, everybody really knows what Noah's Ark looks like. It's like this. So you have a half of a watermelon and a little house in the top and a ladder and a giraffe looking out of the window. So you had this situation of the three choices, so to speak, the cube, the coffin, and the watermelon. So what happened was, when I started to read that tablet, I didn't just read the first few lines, but the whole thing, and it took a long time. It was rather difficult. But eventually, the most amazing material came out of that unappetizing piece of clay which arrived on my table. The first thing which was completely astonishing was that there was a whole new idea there about what the ark looked like, because it wasn't square or oblong or this shape. It was round. And this inscription is a miraculous thing because it comes in at the most dramatic, important moment like this, that they've decided to destroy the world. And one of the gods, called Enki, thinks this will be a bad idea because human beings do all the work. So he picked on this chap called Atram-Hassis, and he whispered that message that I began the translation with. But the thing is, he'd picked this Atram-Hassis to build the boat, to be a Noah, but it's extremely difficult to understand why he picked this man, because he obviously didn't trust him at all about how to do it. So he said to him, like talking to a child, okay, you draw out the plan on the floor, it's a big round circle, and he told him how big it was, and he said you have to have rope, you have to have bitumen, you have to have wood, and he told him exactly how much of all these things he would need in order to build this boat satisfactorily. So this thing, slap bang in the middle of a story, turns out to be specifics for somebody who wants to build an ark when there's a flood on the way. Jolly useful thing. So this is a round boat. So what is a round boat? Well, in this country, not such an unfamiliar thing, because in English, the word for a traditional river boat which is round is a coracle, in Arabic a guffa, and there are places in India where you can still see on the waters fishermen and boatmen using these round coracles in daily life. So this is a marvelous thing, and they had them in ancient Babylonia. So you have this situation of a story where to save the world you have to build a lifeboat which will encapsulate, like a walnut, all the important stuff until it's safe to come out again. And the poet in Babylonia in 1800 thought to himself, well, what kind of boat could it be? So the best thing it could possibly be would be a coracle. So the thing about coracles is they never sink. They may go round and round, they may make you seasick, but they never capsize. So it obviously struck him that this will be the most useful kind of boat, because after all, once everybody's inside, you don't have to go anywhere. There's no front or back, there's no motor or rudder. All you have to do is to bob around on the surface of the water, even if it covers the whole globe until the water subsides, and it comes down again and everybody piles out, has a good shower and starts procreating. So your normal coracle is big enough, as you see in these pictures, perhaps to move yourself, a couple of goats and your mother-in-law from one side of the Euphrates to the other. But, of course, there are record-breaking experiments. The one at the bottom, I think, was the runner-up in the Guinness Book of how many people can you get in a coracle before it sinks. And actually, they were disqualified at the last moment because one of them was a child, and they felt that was immoral. So the thing is this, on a serious basis, this tablet tells us we have to have a giant coracle, and it gives all the information. Well, the thing is, this coracle, as described in the tablet, would not fit in this room by any means whatsoever. Fully built, it's about half the size of a modern football pitch. The area is 3,600 square meters, and the walls are 7 meters high. So it's one heck of a coracle. But the thing is, all the specifications are there. It is a bit like when you go to IKEA to buy a piece of furniture with an unintelligible name, there's usually a label on the side of the cardboard box that tells you what you need in order to put this library table together. Of course, those instructions are totally misleading because half the things are missing and no one can understand them anyway. But with this ancient cuneiform thing, totally different matter. If you learn to read Babylonian, which only takes about 27 years, then you can do it. So what happened was I had this small piece of clay with these specifications on for this very important task in the history of the world. So the cuneiform was difficult, the numbers were difficult, and I have to tell you, I've never built a coracle myself, it's not my line of work, so reading the inscription was not so straightforward. But there were two remarkable aids. This is one of them. In about 1920, photographers on the banks of the rivers in Mesopotamia often recorded daily life, and there's a whole set of these double images of coracles being built, which is very useful. And the third thing is that one of those mad English people who ended up in a strange part of the world and then wrote wonderful books with all the details about them, went round the world recording ethnic boat building, and he wrote a whole chapter in Durbar Scottish English all about how to build a coracle a la Iraqi style. So I had this very interesting thing, photographs of real things from the 1920s, a narrative from an observer which showed that the way that they built coracles in Iraq in the 20th century AD was identical to the way they built them in 1800 BC. Nothing whatsoever had changed. And so I had this unique thing, ancient recipe, Scottish early 20th century description in English and photographs. This has never happened to anybody before in the history of the world, to have an ancient inscription which illuminates and is illuminated by these other resources. It's marvelous. If archaeology had these things on a regular basis, you would have nothing to do. So this is the point I want to share with you. I admit that the Babylonian was difficult and testing, but so was the English narrative by the boat historian. And I read what he wrote about 20 or 30 times before I got the gist of it, and in the end I had to use the Babylonian inscription in order to understand what was written in English. So it's even more remarkable than that. The consequence was that it became absolutely clear what you do. And this is how it worked. Very simple procedure. Remember this if the weather changes. You have to get the pith from the trunk of a palm and twist it and twist it and twist it until it's a very strong rope. And then the rope is laid out on the ground in a circle, and as it comes back to the beginning, the rope is then put on top of the previous one and tied north to south as you go, and you end up with a great floppy waste paper basket made of this material. The next thing is that there are ribs which have to be cut, and they fit inside, shaped to the profile, and as they come down to the bottom, they are knitted together to make a floor. And then this is tied to the basket, so it's all rigid. And then finally, the whole thing is coated in bitumen to make it waterproof. So This is all intelligible and good stuff, but the peculiar thing for me to understand was not so much why the data was included, but why the numbers were so specific. They weren't numbers like millions and millions or the biggest boat you ever saw, but they were specific numbers. So I suddenly had this mad idea. Maybe the numbers are, so to speak, meaningful. And to cut a long story short, it turned out that the statistics given to build this boat were predicated on, were derived from real coracle building, magnified to scale. So all the numbers made sense. How did I know this? Well, it can be proven as follows, because we know that the rope, the constituent rope to make the boat, was given as 1 finger thick. And Enki told Atrahasis something very interesting, which I have to read from this card. Enki, as I told you, didn't trust this guy properly. So he said that how much rope you will need to make this boat. Okay, so we know the length of it from the Babylonian god. We know the thickness of it. So it seemed to me this, since we know the size of the boat, and we know all about it in reality, we could work out the following. If we were going to do this, would there be any match between the ancient length and the modern scientific length you can derive? So, the divine Babylonian estimate for the amount of rope to make this giant coracle was as follows: 14,430 sutu measures. Supposed to go or something. What's the matter with you guys? It's an amazing thing, this, okay? Right. So then I did this. I found this out-of-work genius mathematician, gave him a cup of tea and a sandwich, and said, if we have this situation, we have this number of sutu, can you work out how much we would really need in Babylonian equivalent? So he did it 3 or 4 times, got the same answer, which for a mathematician is proof. In my case, it will be just fortuity. And this was the consequence, that if you did it in modern terminology, rather in ancient terminology, in modern measuring, it comes out as 14,624 sutu. So, let me explain. Divine message, 14,430. It's like a political meeting, isn't it? Actual fact, 14,624. So this comes out as 527 kilometers. In other words, you would need a piece of rope that goes from here to Chandigarh, just to put it in a local term. But the thing is that the difference between the divine calculation and the real calculation is less than 1%. So if you think of a rope that goes from here to Chandigarh and one which is 1% different, you wouldn't even notice it by the time you got to the other end. In other words, these numbers must be serious. They are serious. So the consequence there was my entire life changed. Because the journalist wrote this thing in the newspaper about Noah's Ark. What do you think it was like? And it was round. It was published in the Guardian newspaper about the time of Christmas, when journalists tend to relax. And this changed my life immediately, because all over the internet there was a response. For example, clergymen, especially in the southern parts of America, said, why do we have to believe this guy? I mean, how the hell can anybody read this stuff? And they called for me to be excommunicated for undermining the Old Testament single-handedly. Some people suggested burning at the stake, but generally feeling was excommunication would do. Well, in my case, as I'm Jewish, that didn't worry me any. But this is one thing. The second thing was that all sorts of film producers around the world rang up and said, we got to do a movie. And you know how it is when they ring up. The British Museum has a special rule that when a producer rings up and says, we got to do a movie, we put the phone down, because of this, that when you are an earnest and committed curator, knowing the truth, and you find yourself in a documentary at the hands of one of these merciless bastards, what happens is this, that when the film comes out, there you are, looking red-faced and embarrassed, talking on the screen, and it's almost exactly what you said when you were in the studio, except there are small omissions. For example, the word not is removed. So you say something is instead of isn't, and therefore they undermine truth on a horrible basis. So we hate them all, every single one of them. And when they rang up, I said no, one after the other, until something interesting happened, that some guy rang up who was English, and a discreet question by me established that he could read on his own. So we were obviously dealing with a different caliber of individual. So he came to the museum, we had a meeting about it, and I said I would like to do a documentary different from every documentary ever made, which told the truth as we understand it. And he said, gosh, that's a novel breakthrough idea, maybe we'll even try it. So to cut a long story short, they raised £100 million or £200 million or whatever it was, and we decided to make the film. So what was the film? We had to do it in Kerala in India, because we couldn't do it in Iraq because we'd all be killed, and they thought it wasn't worth the sacrifice. And after a lot of inquiry, Kerala was felt to be Iraqi-ish in appearance. It had water, it had palm trees, it had wood, and it had supposed bitumen. So this is what happened. I wrote the book, meanwhile, sitting at home, tearing my hair out and being ascetic. And this is the book that came out, marvellous book. So I thought to myself, this film derived from this book is really my film. So I wanted to write the dialogue, I wanted to do the camera work, I wanted to write the music and do the makeup, the whole caboodle. Okay? So what actually happened when things got warmed up is they shut every door on me, and I could never, ever get a word in about my film. And what they did is they took me for lunch, okay? Never, ever go for lunch with a producer of a television program, because they think that shuts you up. So there are various issues about which seethe in my brain. No, I wouldn't say seethe, I wouldn't say I feel violent or full of hatred. I wouldn't say that for a moment. I just feel that they didn't listen to me at their peril. So they went to India, they raised the money, they got a marvellous team of chaps who, there were three Western scholars of boat building, led by a man called Tom Vosmer, an Australian, who's the grand man of all this material. They built Islamic boats from manuscripts and from archaeological materials. They're the experts. So they thought this was absolutely lovely, except when I sent the translation and they discovered that this boat was going to be half the size of a football pitch, Tom Vosmer was hospitalised for about a week until we told him that if he really wanted to, he could make it a little bit smaller. And they did do that in the end for several reasons. One, instead of costing £100 million, it would have cost £4 billion. And the second one was it would have taken about 10 years to make it. But the most important excuse, and I thought it was rather an excuse, was that if they built this thing with wooden ribs in accordance with the ancient prescription, there would be a problem because the weight could not be supported. You couldn't build the ribs strong enough. And so they decided to make it about between a third and 2/3 of the original. You will see a picture in a minute, so it was no small achievement. So without my going anywhere near the place, they got on with this building, and it went for about 4 months. And I've got some photographs, two of about 4,000, sorry. Whoops. Hello? Can we go backwards? One. Yes. So I've brought you 4 or 5 pictures to show you actually what happened in Aleppi, in Kerala, when they built this boat. So these are some of the chaps beginning the coiling out of this coir or this rope to make the substance or the walls of the boat. And this is how it began to take shape from underneath. And they decided that they would have to well, you'll see what happens. Actually, let me just tell you about this elephant. This elephant never got paid for his participation. I felt it was a grievous matter. He didn't have a lawyer, which made it even more complicated. And I wanted in exchange this elephant to come back to the British Museum with me, and I'll tell you for why. Because in the British Museum, we have doors from the departments into the galleries, which are much larger than normal. They're larger, for example, than the ones at the back of the room. And once I came out into the public gallery with my keys, and an American couple were there, and one of them said to me, oh, do you mind my asking, why are the doors here so impressively big? Why are they like this? And I said, for some devilish reason, without any contemplation, well, it goes back to the time of the British Raj, you see, because in those days the keepers used to come to work on elephants. And And they walked up the gallery saying, yeah, I think that's amazing. I mean, and I had to run after them and say it wasn't true. But ever since then, I felt we ought to have an elephant in the museum, and this one would have been ideal. But there was the visa problem and everything. So the workmen, there were about 40 or 50 of them, and they were specialists. Some did wood, some did the rope, and some did bitumen. And they had in charge of each group a kind of foreman, and they worked together before on many such projects. So they were all very familiar and easy with one another, and they worked like ballet dancers on a stage. It was extraordinary. There was no problem. They were just brilliant. And everything was done by hand. There was no glue or nails or anything of this kind used. And I just want to show you this picture because right at the end, just before the launch, they decided when I couldn't do any more damage that perhaps they would let me come and see the boat go onto the water. So Joanna and I, my wife, we went together, and when we got there, all this stuff, of course, had been long constructed. So this is a unique situation because this is the lower half on the inside of the boat. So you can see the ribs which make the floor, which begin to curve up out of sight, as described in the tablet, and then the outer skin is made of this wraparound material, and then as described also in the tablet, there are stanchions which are stood on the cross beams to allow there to be a deck. Now, you never have a deck on a normal coracle, but in this super coracle it was necessary because the human beings lived upstairs and the animals were all going to go downstairs. There might be time for questions if I shut up soon enough, but if anybody is going to ask me what do they do with the dung, I don't know. A lot of people find this the most pressing issue about the whole Ark question. Anyway, this construction, when we went in there, was remarkable because the light flickered down from the floor above, and it was freshly made of wood by hand, and it was like a cathedral inside. It was incredibly beautiful, as well as being more than just an archaeological reconstruction. So this, for example, is two of the heroes at work applying the outer coating of bitumen to the finished vessel to fully waterproof it. Now, in ancient Iraq and modern Iraq, bitumen bubbles out of the ground as a free gift of nature, and it is black, viscous and unpleasant and highly carcinogenic, but it is extremely effective as a waterproof material, and for millennia the ancient Mesopotamians have used it for all sorts of purposes. So the man who wrote the tablet knew this was going to be the case, but the Iraqis would not allow us to buy a tanker full of Iraqi bitumen because it was cultural property. As we know, cultural property cannot be exported from one country to another. So the cultural bitumen had to stay where it was. So this meant that at the last minute, somebody who worked for the film company had to buy bitumen in India. Now, I don't know whether any of you have ever built a large ark needing bitumen in India, but be very, very careful because there's a black market. And the thing is, you get ripped off with mediocre stuff. How do I know ripped off? I tell you for why. Because real bitumen, for example, dries. And it goes hard like this, and it is impervious to water. And this cheap stuff we got on the market never went hard. It drooped, it came off, and in fact was a kind of anti-bitumen. And so these poor blokes worked in unbelievable heat, surrounded by cauldrons of seething, bubbling, viscous material, pretending to be bitumen, which made it twice as hot, and they had to replaster and replaster this vessel. They all ought to have got OBEs, but I don't suppose they would have wanted one. So this is the star cast of the movie. That's Tom Vosmer in the hat, and Alessandro Guidoni, the Italian one, with his arms folded, was the main student of Tom, apart from Eric, who's in the dark blue shirt, who was another student. And these three people between them encapsulate virtually the whole knowledge of ancient boat building in wherever it applies in the world. They are really geniuses. And then there's me pretending to understand what they're talking about. So when we got there, it was just before the launch. And as I said, I really wanted to dominate this film and make them do what I wanted. And one of my ideas was this. You know Hitchcock, another well-known film director, rather like me, as I thought of it. Hitchcock always used to like to have a little cameo moment in his films so that the aficionado would spot him and say, look, there he is. That was my sort of role model. So I thought that what we do, we get a couple of rhinos, and I'd wear my hair loose and wear white clothes and sandals looking like Jesus, and I would smack the rhinos on the bum so that they would go in the ark. I thought that would be a lovely moment, and enough, because, I don't have any ego problem with this. It was just a small gesture, and they said no. And all my other ideas were dismissed in that cavalier way, but I got my revenge. You see, what happened was this. When Joanna and I got there, just before the launch, about an hour and a half before, the boat was on the edge of the water, and it was a gigantic thing, you can imagine, so they built it as close as possible to the edge of the water. And between there, all the ground of the yard was like churned up mud, rather like a rugby pitch on a wet afternoon, and there were people trudging across it doing jobs, and there was a woman with a camera on a tripod ready to film the ark when it moved, like a big game hunter. So I'd given up by then making suggestions about anything. It was rather a tense moment because they all thought it was going to sink, of course. It couldn't possibly sink because everything it was made of would float, and if you have three things that float together, why would they sink, was my argument. But anyway, the thing was this. At the very last moment, it became clear that all my propaganda had not been wasted because this producer had made arrangements locally to have a little bit of livestock. So this is what he did. He paid a pittance to two skinny gentlemen to bring goats. So the leaves of the clearing parted, and these two chaps came in with goats on strings, 5 in each hand. And they came as if prearranged into this muddy period, and they drove sticks, long sticks, one here and one there, and they tethered these goats in expectation. And it was then that we realized what a cheap trick this guy had in mind. Okay, so don't forget, we have 2 specimens of the whole of creation to go on the boat. So what he was going to do is this. He was going to have 2 goats at the head of a queue which you had to imagine. So goat 1, goat 2, and of course all creation behind them, like queuing up at the post office to the horizon, but you only needed to see the first 2. This was his idea, a cheap skate version. Okay, so the camera was ready. They wanted to launch the boat. It was necessary to get these guys for their passport photographs. And what happened was this, that of course the 2 goats who came from different strings of family decided that headbutting was a lot more interesting than photography, which they pursued vigorously for some time, and then they decided that sexual intercourse was even more preferable. So there was a lot of flurry of limbs in the mud, and the producer had to pay this bloke a lot of money to get these things out of the way as soon as possible. So this is what it looked like. So remember that a normal coracle is about this big, and that what it looked like on the edge of the shipyard before it was ready to go. And I've got a couple of pictures when you can see the thing about to go in the water. And it was a big problem because the bottom of it was curved and covered in bitumen and very delicate, so you couldn't drag it like you would do with a lifeboat, for example. And they did something rather clever. The ship guy owner looked in the yellow pages for massive arc shifters, and a couple of guys came over with these rubber tubes and a thing to blow them up, as if they launched massive arcs every day of the week. No big deal for them. So they put these tubes under the body of the boat. They were then inflated to full, so they became like round sausages, and then the boat beautifully rolled forward, and these things became like wheels. So with a bit of hijinks, it was like, well, most men will tell you that the most dramatic thing they've ever encountered is witnessing the birth of one of their children, if they commit to that kind of hanky-panky at all. But many men would say that. Well, I can tell you, I have 5 children, I'm glad to say, but it was nothing in comparison with launching this boat, which was my boat, built according to my specifications by me in my film as I saw it, with everything to gain and lose. And it was a tense moment. It went in the water. and it floated. You see, on water there. This is special water, which is only about 5 foot deep. So the bottom of the boat very nearly touched the bottom of the water. But to be on the safe side, so to speak, and there were no tides, of course, and no wind or anything. It was just inert. It was a pond, so it was not full of risk. But of course it wasn't going to sink because it's a big boat. That's all it was. So it did float perfectly. It did leak slightly. And in fact, there were people who made a bit of a fuss about this leak. There were people who said it was a failure. It leaked. And it leaked, exclamation mark, things like that. Well, I can tell you, and this is my answer to that kind of stupid question. Have you ever been in a rowing boat that was dry? I mean, have you ever sat in a rowing boat where there wasn't water in the bottom? No, exactly. So what do you expect? A thing this big, twice the size of this room, there's not going to be a little bit of water? And actually the reason it leaked is because of this cheap bitumen. Cheap bitumen. Anyway, it may have leaked. They had a pump. In fact, they had 2 pumps, and they pumped like billy-o, and there were things floating about in the bottom. But that's neither here nor there. It was a little bit leaky, but it could have gone to America if it wanted. Now, I have to tell you a couple of things before I get to the main point of this lecture. The first one, as you'll notice there are clouds in the sky. Well, old men who were in the shipyard said that they hadn't seen clouds in the sky, nor had their fathers or grandfathers in that part of India for about 273 years. So they all believed that that was because of me, because it was a flood story, and they thought that when we had the boat ready, out came the clouds as if they'd been booked over the telephone. Well, I tried to smile this off in a modest way, but things got a bit more complicated because once the boat was launched, there was a great deal of hilarity and everyone was relaxed and all the workmen wanted to be photographed next to me one by one. It was a great moment in my life, although physically demanding because some were up here and some were down here, and we had to do it with everybody, and it was lovely. And one of my best moments, really. And on the way plane back, I said to one of the film company how gratifying it was that the workmen were so warm and friendly to us and how we felt so wonderful about it. And the producer said, I don't see why that should be so surprising. He said, they all thought that you were a descendant of Noah anyway. So, I've got about another hour and a half of lecture to go. Hello? I don't like to say this, but you're supposed to say something or do something.
The incantation nearly worked. I think you need to incant.
So far it's been going well, the incantation. Okay, that's it. Okay, now look, this is you have to pay attention here. This is a very serious matter. When we'd done all the filming, we had to park this thing. I mean, you can't just leave it because it will drift all over the place. So it had to be moored somewhere. So what we did is have it towed down some waterways to where there was a suitable place that had been arranged already. So you can see what this boat looks like in action. And as we came down this river, it was late evening after tea, and the waterways were lined with tourist boats of individuals who'd gone out for the day, drinking gin and tonic since breakfast. So by 5 o'clock they were pretty much gone, and they were all lounging around and thinking they're having a really good and risky time. And as we went past from this beautiful craft of ours, they all snapped awake one by one, and they all said, "Look, it's Noah's Ark." And I thought, we just spent £10 billion to make something that doesn't look like Noah's Ark. It's Babylonian. And they immediately recognised it. Why? Because from the profile, there's this little house that we built, like a mudif from Iraq, for the people to live in, and so forth. So from the side, it looks like Noah's Ark unmistakably. See how annoying that was? You can't imagine. I kept saying, "No, it isn't! No, it isn't!" But they were really drunk. So this is what it really looked like. Now, if you saw that for the first time, you wouldn't think of Noah's Ark, would you? No, right? See, it's round. Is it not round, you see? It's round, right? Okay. This is really what it was like. They didn't fill in the floor entirely so that the film could cover all those things. And this house that was there was, in fact, an imitation of one of the mudifs from southern Iraq made of reeds, which are a very traditional thing, which reaches back to Sumerian times. And, of course, from the tablet, you had this boat. The tablet has a matching roof, because the rain would come in. But we're a bit short of money to do that. And of course, somebody also pointed out that if we put a roof on it, no one could see inside. So they decided to leave that out. So eventually we had to park this thing. It was a really sad moment. You'll notice in good Nelson style, I was the last man to disembark. And our poor craft, after its great career, was left there. So there are just two things I want to tell you before I release you for the pleasures of the day. One is this. You know from the Bible that Noah's Ark landed on Mount Ararat. Okay? This is a well-known thing. Should be a well-known thing. Well, I thought we all knew that, but... Hello? $50 for another one? I don't know. It's all your fault.
Your incantation is leaky.
You shouldn't have told them about the incantation. Well, no, but it's... You believe it's round? Well, it's something completely different I wanted to show you. Okay. It's all right. So after all the research and everything, we found this disconcerting thing. Well, this spurred me on to greater effort. And it was rather easy to make greater effort because of this. So this is another cuneiform tablet. So look, here you are. Now you've seen two in one morning. It's very good for you. I think you'll never be quite the same again, probably. So on the left is the oldest map of the world known. Okay, it was written in Babylon in about 600 BC. So you'll see the diagram to the right. All you have to notice is this, that the world in which we live is considered to be round, and it is surrounded by a ring of water. And off the perimeter of this water there are various mountains. And this tablet is a cosmic map to show how Mesopotamia, which is inside the circle with the big river Euphrates and the cities marked, is surrounded by a ring of water. And if you go across this water to the rim of the world in different directions, a great mountain rises out onto the horizon. So it's a rather useful thing to know if you're in that kind of position. So the front of the tablet has the drawing, and the one on the back has an inscription of what is to be seen on every one of the mountains. Now there's a rule in Assyriology that the more interesting the tablet, the more broken it is. And you can see that elephants have kneeled on this tablet repeatedly in order to make it illegible. But nevertheless, there are bits and pieces that can be extracted about the different mountains. And one of them, it says, if you cross the water in your boat and you land on this mountain, you will see something whose wooden blocks, it says. I put ... because then I didn't know what the word was, but it's now, forget the dots, it's block. Whose wooden blocks are as thick as a parsiktu. Well, nobody is ever going to faint when they read this inscription, the block as thick as a parsiktu. But if you read that tablet, you have a heart attack. I tell you for why. Because when Atrahasis built the boat according to this inscription, every time he did something, he stood in front of the god and said, I've done this, I made the ribs of your boat as thick as a parsiktu, he said. And this expression is nowhere else known in Babylonia. Why? Because a parsiktu is a volume measure and not a length measure. So it's a kind of expression, like you say, thick as two short planks or something like this in English. So, as thick as a parsiktu bottle is a kind of phrase, a specific phrase, and we have it used by the human reporting about the ribs of the ark which he'd built to the god who'd ordered it. And there on this mountain there are something of this dimension, which can only be the ribs of the ark itself, which settled on the mountain, and everything rotted away except the ribs. So if you sail across this sea and you land on the mountain, you'll see against the sky these great ribs, which are the Babylonian ark. So this is the origin of the story in the Bible that Noah's ark landed on a mountain. But in Hebrew, the place is called Ararat or Urartu in the book of Genesis. The ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. Now the thing is this. On this map, it's possible to work out which of those mountains was the right one according to the Babylonians. So we can see, we have a map to know where they thought their ark landed. And it's this one here with the yellow arrow in the northeast. According to them, if you go there, you will see these wooden things which are that thick still left on the mountain. So we have this marvelous ancient map which tells us where it happened. Of course, there are millionaires all over the world who are looking for Noah's Ark. They find it more or less every 2 or 3 weeks anyway. But we have an ancient map which tells us where the ancients thought it was. But there's something rather delicious. Because let's say we're on that mountain with our cameras and we photograph those ribs and we decide to go home to Babylon and tell everybody. So we come down the mountain and we cross that water and we come to the rim of the world, and the map is rather nicely labelled which country you meet first. And that country is called Urartu. And Urartu is the Assyrian name of Armenia, and it's the same word as Ararat in Hebrew. So the story in Genesis works like this. When they learnt the story, they were told it landed on a mountain. Where's the mountain? Oh, it's there. It's beyond Armenia, Urartu. So the Urartu word gets into the Bible because none of the people, none of the Judeans ever went anywhere near Armenia. They didn't know anything about it. They just knew it was in that direction. But it is the right direction. It's exactly the right direction. But in the Hebrew understanding, Urartu is in our world, and in the Babylonian, you go to the end of our world, and then you go into the thing beyond, and there is the boat where no man will ever see again. So that's really quite interesting because it locks carefully the story of where this Ararat thing comes in the Bible. And then finally, I told you I got into trouble with some people, burning at the stake and so forth and so forth. But the most exquisite punishment I got was twofold. Firstly, when Britain was overrun with coastal flooding and many people lost their houses, a lot of people wrote to me and said that this was my fault. I'd messed around with it all again, and it was my fault. Okay, I thought that was a bit difficult to answer. But then Joanna and I, one Easter, decided to go away for a few days, and when we woke up in the morning in the hotel, we went for a drive. We passed this very old church, and we thought we'd go and have a look because we like old churches. So we walked through, opened the gate, and in the postern gate, there was the big door of the church, a couple of feet in front, where you would go in. And the thing was, as it was Easter, we didn't know whether there was a service on. So I put my ear to the crack in the door to hear if there was any singing. And as I did so, there was a kind of on the back of my head. And I looked up, and there, and you can see, photographed by my daughter, on the rafters was a perfect white dove. Now, this wasn't a pigeon, okay? It wasn't any old bird. It was a white dove. So I think to myself, okay, this must be a favoured dove lavatory. So being a good detective, I look down to see whether there are earlier deposits. No earlier deposits. So the only rational conclusion is that this dove was waiting for me, and he knew that sooner or later I would be within range, and then on behalf of Noah, he got me. Thank you. Yes? Lovely. Yes, by all means.
We have a few minutes, do we? Thank you so much for a talk that was
would like to ask
exciting.
some questions.
Riveting.
If you would like to ask some questions.
Well, I was going to say something nice about it.
For questions.
I'm not allowed to, I'm afraid.
Yes?
When they're making an epic. The last Noah's Ark film I saw had Russell, the Australian actor. Why is the Ark not round when Hollywood makes movies?
Have you seen that film?
Yes, I have.
Did you sit through the whole of it?
It wasn't round. The Ark wasn't round. It was like the boats we see now? I mean,
What can you do in the world? If you're a wise man, you speak wisdom. Do the fools listen? Has it ever been different? They didn't consult me.
they should have.
I suggested sending a copy of my book to Russell Crowe, and it was discussed at the publisher's Hodder, and they said that they thought he'd be very unlikely to be able to get through the first page on his own, so it was a waste of postage. So that's how it was.
I want to ask you about the other ark, the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia.
Oh, that's a different ark.
Yes, I know, but what are your thoughts about that?
I don't have any thoughts about that. I've just devoted about 10 years of my life to thinking out this ark. And now I'm having a bit of a breather. If you really think I should give another decade to ark number 2, I'll look into it. But at the moment, I don't know anything about it.
Thank you.
Well, it's been widely distributed, I believe, in different formats. I think it might be on YouTube, I'm not sure. When you say the film that I made, this is the technically incorrect statement. It was a film in which I fitfully was made by somebody else. I mean, I'm not strongly feeling about it. It's just, sorry, yeah, fine. I think it's on YouTube, I think so, yeah.
Are there other items in the archaeological record representing the story of
other
of the
inscriptions,
ark?
you mean?
Yes.
Well, there are two kinds of evidence. So I showed you at the beginning this George Smith's tablet from about 700 BC, and the new one is about 1800 BC. So that's two, and those are the kind of two ends. And in between, there are perhaps 9 or 10 other fragments of tablets which have a bit of the story, so that we know that the flood story existed in different cities, but none of them is complete, and none of them has a description of the boat. It's all broken at that stage, so it was most fortuitous. Oh, I didn't tell you the most marvelous thing about this tablet. I completely forgot that it says that when the animals are to go on board, it says they should go on 2 by 2 in the Babylonian. And this is something which achieved some notoriety in the Bible, was much surpassed by that irritating song that children all know about the animals. I'm not going to sing it, because if I do, they'll be singing it in your head for the rest of the day. But everybody in the world knows about the animals going in 2 by 2. But in this 18th century tablet, there the words were preserved. So that the whole conception that it was one of each species and so forth is locked into the story, and it's part of the history of the whole tradition. And of course, just one other thing, there is a certain amount of evidence of archaeological type, if I may defer to you, which has been claimed to be a sort of evidence that there really was a flood stuff. And it's really deposits of riverine mud in major cities with nothing in it, with archaeology, so to speak, on top, then a long deposit of mud, and then archaeology underneath. So this is clearly this kind of problem, but they don't tie in chronologically. They are fitful, and we know that the Euphrates and Tigris flood, we know that floods are part of their reality, and that's a different thing from what must have been a kind of tsunami. And my own feeling is that the power of the story in Babylonia, which was not just on this scrappy tablet, but a whole long narrative about the gods and what they did and the destruction and everything, it reflects a real persistent psychological fear of the destruction of the world, which existed in their psychology and must be based on a real episode. So probably in very remote prehistory, 5,000 BC, 7,000 BC, I don't know that you could ever hope to prove it scientifically, but the weight of the literary tradition shows that people had this at the back of their minds. It's like people who live on top of a volcano or near a volcano or in California, where every time something wobbles, the fear that they keep at the back of their heads comes to the fore. And I think that the flood in Mesopotamia had that same sort of idea. And one other point I didn't mention, which is really crucial, is that the gods decided that life had to finish because people and animals were so noisy. It was nothing to do with the principle of wickedness as it is in the Bible. And this is important because the Babylonians had no moral question about it. It was because of racket, and they couldn't sleep properly. And when the Judeans adopted this story and wove it into the texts of the Bible, there it became an instrument of teaching, where the destruction was because of unbridled sin, which was intolerable, and punishment had to ensue. And God only relented at the last minute to allow one survival. So they took the literary story and they recycled it in their own form. Hollywood recycled it in a lower form. Yes.
This.
You received.
Yeah.
Do you know how that person got the tablet?
Yes, I do. It belonged to a man called Douglas Simmons, who was a sort of scientist whom we already knew in our department. He'd come in periodically with odd bits and pieces. Because what had happened when he was at school, it's a rather interesting thing. He said that, he told me this, that when he was at school, in his exams, once, he did much better than his parents expected. Now, I've never heard of that ever happening before or since. It's just a remarkable thing. And his father was so taken with this, he told me, that he went up in the loft and brought down a sort of bag of bits and pieces that he himself had collected in his wanderings. He was in the Middle East in the army, and he must have bought this thing together with, there were Chinese bits and pieces, some Egyptian, Greek things. It was a miscellany of small antiquities, including this tablet, which no other person had ever looked at. So he brought it in, and there it was. I mean, it was just the most amazing thing. So that's it. Yeah. Well, the thing is this. He brought it in the first time, and I said, "Oh, this is rather interesting. This is part of the flood story." And he said, "Good, thank you." And he took it, and I didn't see him again for quite a long time. In fact, he was in the galleries once in an exhibition I'd organised, and I saw him. I went over and said, "You remember this? Hello, do you remember this?" And he brought it in again, and he left it with me. And it was then that I really started to work on it. And I have to say, it is the sort of thing that is like a sponge. It's a good analogy that you have to squeeze it like this to get every kind of bit of information out of it, because it's broken and complicated. And he left it with me for a long time to study it. So I had regular heart failure. The most extreme thing was deciphering this word for 2 by 2, because nobody had ever seen that before on a tablet, and that was really, I almost dropped it. I didn't get undressed, but I almost dropped it, because that is a very surprising thing to read for the first time in that funny script. Yeah. So it was a big adventure, really. Yes, hello.
We would have liked to continue with the session, but I'm really very sorry we're falling short of time. So sorry.
Okay.
So we'll have to come. We had a lovely session and a little token of appreciation from our side. And we had a lovely audience. Thank you so much, audience, for being here and being so patient. Irving would be there at the book signing area. Center, Durbar Hall. So from 11:10 to 12:10, readings, identities, Tulsi Badrinath, R. Raj Rao and Shujoy Datta, introduced by Mohini Gupta.
The humanities makes us ask the big questions. What's it all about? What's the purpose of life?
What does it mean to lose someone? What is loss about?
Nature of the human being, guilt and innocence.
It's like the pulsating brain of the universe.
More than a place, it's a spirit of inquiry.
Major intellectual crossroads of the universe.
There's a sense of curiosity, excitement.
Issues that won't stay still in one
The
discipline.
Humanities Center is really the beating heart of this university.
राह गलिया डगर गांव नगर या शहर राह गलिया डगर गांव नगर या शहर आसमां छूने चला है इंडिया आसमां छूने चला है इंडिया
दिन हो या शाम या सहर स्वच्छता है एक लहर
दिन हो या शाम या सहर स्वच्छता है एक लहर ये लहर उठा चुका है इंडिया फैसला ये कर चुका है इंडिया बनेगा 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 स्वच्छ इंडिया बनेगा बनेगा स्वच्छ इंडिया बीमारियों को देश मेरा छोड़ना होगा कोना कोना स्वच्छता से जोड़ना होगा स्वच्छता से इंडिया जगमगाएगा विश्व सारा इंडिया के गीत गाएगा बेटियां स्कूल में गुनगुनाएंगी आशा की सुबह संग मुस्कुराएंगी बेटियां स्कूल में गुनगुनाएंगी आशा की सुबह के साथ मुस्कुराएंगी यहाँ वहाँ इधर उधर जहाँ भी जाएगी नजर कह रहा है ये सफर स्वच्छता का रंग भर आसमां छूने चला है इंडिया आसमां छूने चला है इंडिया फैसला ये कर चुका है इंडिया फैसला ये कर चुका है इंडिया बनेगा 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 स्वच्छ इंडिया बनेगा बनेगा स्वच्छ इंडिया बनेगा बनेगा स्वच्छ इंडिया बनेगा बनेगा स्वच्छ इंडिया बनेगा
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. We would begin the session shortly. Welcome to the 9th Z Jaipur Literature Festival at Mahindra Humanities Center, Durbar Hall. To know the next session at JLF, you can give a missed call on 9251-301-339 and receive them on your phone. This facility is not available on DND numbers. Win a chance to win JLF goodies. Tweet using the hashtag ZJLF. The more you tweet, the more you would get. Exciting prizes are up for grabs. For more details, visit the information desk. Brochures available at the information desk, sold at ₹100. Festival merchandise are online at the festival near Charbagh also. Books available at the festival bookstore. Our next session is Readings, Identities, and the session will be introduced by Mohini Gupta. Over to you, Mohini.
Yes, thank you.
We have with us Tulsi Badrinath, R. Raj Rao, and Shujoy.
Is that working? Yes. Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the session on identities. We have three fantastic writers with us today, Shujoy Datta, R. Raja Rao and Tulsi Badrinath. I'm going to give a quick introduction and then I'm going to hand it over to them to start reading from their respective writings. As a short introduction, Shujoy Datta has worked for a long time in the advertising space as a creative director and a planning director. His latest novel is being published by Speaking Tiger, and the novel revolves around a family of psychics, and I'm going to let him speak to you more about it, but he says that the novel is about our beliefs and the stories that we tell ourselves. No, I'll start. I'll just give a quick introduction to everyone and then we can move on to individual. Try and bring it closer.
Hello?
Yeah. I'll just introduce all three and then we can move.
Hello?
Okay. That I think works. Okay. Moving on to Tulsi Badrinath. She is a banker turned writer and dancer now. Her first two novels were longlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize, and her first work of non-fiction was named as the top 10 books by Hindustan Times. Her latest publication is a collection of essays by her father, and it's called Chaturvedi Badrinath, and today she's going to talk about her own writings, which also focus around philosophical ideas. I think her first two novels were about Vedanta and Karma, respectively, and his novels, which are also philosophical essays. So she's going to link the two by talking about it today. And it's amazing because she really writes about the most complex philosophical ideas in the most accessible and simple way. So I'm hoping you all get a flavor of that. Moving on to R. Raja Rao. He is a poet, playwright, writer, translator, biographer, queer theorist. He has co-translated the transgender activist Lakshmi Tripathi's Mi Hijra Mi Lakshmi, and he's currently working on his fourth novel. Today he's going to be reading out his poetry, which he says is sort of about the issue of censorship, and more importantly, putting self-censorship to the test. And he has also told me, and I would like to tell all of you, that his new pen name is Raja Rao Jr. Okay, so moving on to the readings. The overarching theme for today's session is identities, since all of them have somehow dealt with some aspect of identity, and they're going to bring that out in their readings now. So, should I ask you to start off with some? I think so.
So let me just tell you a little bit about what this book is about. For me, Indian fiction seems to move in two different directions. It's very well crafted, very well written, but not engaging, and very engaging, very plot-worthy, but not very readable in terms of craftsmanship. So for me, it was important to write what I've been accused of writing, which is high-minded commercial fiction. But really, the book is a book about beliefs, and I've tried to write it in a lighter way. So let me just give you a sense of what the novel's about, and then maybe we can come around. So I'll read out the first page of the novel, which should give you a sense of what the book is about, and then as we move on, I'll tell you a little bit more about what the identities or what the fundamental questions of beliefs, sense of self, etc. are about. Okay? My father could smell death. He describes it as an overpowering odor of festering rot. My grandmother had more abilities than I can describe in a line. My sister can communicate with the dead, or let's just say with other dimensions. My uncle can see spirits. My aunts, well, my father's cousins really, get a lot of deja vu. And my mother, I think, just has feminine intuition. What I'm leading up to is this. We have a streak in the family, a strong psychic streak. Perhaps it comes from the fact that we're always praying or something. A typical conversation in my home is about the nature of God. Is God the sum total of all consciousness, or is God the quality that pervades all consciousness while we butter our toasts? I kid you not. Or perhaps we just have some genetic material, more links in the corpus callosum or hippocampus or whatever. Whatever it is, it's there in different degrees, and since I came after many decades of praying, or because I'm the youngest or further down in the evolutionary chain, my gift is special. Okay, so that's what the protagonist is about. And I think we'll come back to when we move on.
Tulsi, would you like to?
Can you hear me? This works? Brilliant. I was going to read from my father's work, which I'll do later now. I think after having heard what Shujoy read, I want to read a passage from my own book, because he talked about God and a presence. And in this book, which was my second work of fiction, a very typical Indian situation where there's a father who has to pay for his daughter's wedding, and obviously it's beyond his means. I don't know why every Indian father, or families, we tend to do that. He's a curator in a museum, so what he does is he borrows a gold coin and he thinks he will return it after pawning it in the interim, thereby raising money for his daughter's wedding. And a chain of events occurs, and he discovers that he's no longer in a position to return the coin. In fact, he's been told that this priceless coin that dates back to Jahangir's time has been melted. So it provokes in him, and it allowed me to sort of talk about karma, or what is it that makes things happen, the idea of causality in the world. On reaching home, Harihar crumpled, bemoaning his fate. He was up against something obdurate, unyielding. He could feel it in the depths of his soul. He truly must have done something appalling in a previous life. Tears welled in his eyes, he wept. The pressure was incessant. There was a fog in his mind, and he knew something lay beneath it. But he could only focus and force himself to contemplate the coin-shaped, ash-filled crater for a second or two before the fog moved in, obscuring it. Again, he felt he would worry at the insubstantial grey, his mind splintered, bright around it. And there's more, but I think we can sort of come back.
Moving on to you, maybe you could read out a little bit of your poetry, and then we can have some conversation around each of these.
Good morning. I could have read from my latest novel. It's called Lady Lolita's Lover. And friends, writer friends and professor friends of mine have said that this is a work of pornography and that this is obscene, which I take as a compliment. But I'm not going to read from fiction, unlike Shujoy and Tulsi. I'm going to read these new poems that I'm writing, some of them. I want to point out that these poems must be, have to be read and understood in the context of a law that we have in this country, which is a criminal law. It's part of the Indian Penal Code. And the law, of course, as many of you would know, is Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes same-sex love. You can call it homosexuality if you want. And by extension, it does also criminalize gay writing, you know. So a gay writer, by that definition, is no different from, say, a militant or a terrorist or a murderer. And these poems have to be seen in that light. So far, there have been no arrests of gay writers, though there have been arrests under Section 377, even in the last 1 year. But there's no saying what can happen in the future, given the times in which we live. So I'll just read one or two in the first round. This one is called You Are Terrorists. You are terrorists with masked faces. Your pens are guns. Your words are ammunition with which you kill. You want to secede from the Union and have an independent homeland where men fuck men, where you will say Gay Hind instead of Jai Hind. Gay Hind, actually, instead of Jai Hind. This is sex jihad. You are pederasts. You insert your tools into our kids' backsides, just as you ran your planes into the windows of the WTC towers. You ambush young men in public urinals and make funnels of their assholes. You are suicide bombers. Good with hand grenades and hand jobs. You are anarchists who want to demolish structures and reduce things to rubble. Stonewall was no different from the Bombay and Paris attacks that killed law-enforcing policemen. You are Maoists. You lure blue-collared workers with fake currency notes to make whores of them. You are cannibals who prey on the flesh of your own kind. You are dogs. You must be kept on leash. Our wives and kids are afraid of you. You need laws to harness you, 370 and 377. We must put you in concentration camps, as the Nazis put the Jews. But even there, you will sleep on top of each other, 20 to a bunk, and discharge spunk. We must hang you.
Thank you so much. You had
Thank you.
said that they were militant in that sense. And
Yes.
Sentiment. Thank you. Shujoy, before we go on to the next reading, can you just tell us a little bit about your journey from the advertising world into the world of writing?
The journey, without boring the pants off you all, advertising is a pretty creative profession. I think it has been said that there is no greater wastage of the human mind outside a chess tournament than in an advertising agency. Yes, in an advertising agency, you're constantly generating ideas. I'd say about a 10th or a 15th of them make it to the outside world. So, you're constantly festering with creative frustration, and I think everyone is looking out to do something of their own. So this book has been many years in the making. I started it in 2007. Then I didn't know what to do with it, so I came back and started working, and then for many years, the voice of the principal character, Anando, was sort of in my head, and it felt like an injustice not to have told the story. So then finally in 2013, I took a break from work and I wrote it. And it was odd, because you think that you're writing all the time, you're involved with words all the time, that'll be easy, but it wasn't easy, certainly not in the beginning. And I read a lot of what writers write about writing, how you get down to the process. And I must say, it's I don't know about the two of you, for me, it was it was a pretty changing experience. I thought I was losing my mind. Maybe it was because my principal character is such an oddball. I would get up in the night and I would feel like licking drains, and I would say, what trouble can I get into tonight? And I think that was principally because, I don't know what other people believe, but I think writing is allowing yourself to be a channel for either the protagonist or a certain thought or a certain way of thinking. And when you do that, then it sort of transforms you. So for me, I felt quite transformed, and now I'm back to being an advertising person, unfortunately. So yeah, no more licking drains.
Until the next book.
Until the next book.
I think you were also introduced as one of your protagonists.
Yeah, I was introduced as my protagonist once, and I said, yeah, that sort of takes non-fiction to another level. So yes, I think the characters do work through authors, and the second book or moving on is tricky, especially when you're forced to read and reread sections from a protagonist whose voice is quite nutty.
Thank you. Tulsi, what about you? How did you come around to writing your first work of?
It's strange. I began writing poetry when I was 8 years old. And I didn't know it was anything wonderful that I'd done, except that my mother was so excited about this little poem that I'd written that it seemed to me that there was something worthwhile about this. And then the poetry flowed for quite a number of years. But when I went to America to study, it dried up. And I don't know if there's a metaphor there. But after that, I just couldn't write poetry. But if you'd asked me, I'd have said I'm a poet. And I always thought there'd be a book of poems, that would come out. And then I joined a bank because I had this degree, and therefore, you sort of worked in the corporate world. And that's where fiction sort of came into play. And I began to write about campus life in America. That book didn't get published, but I did finish it. So that process of starting something and just working, on completing a work of fiction, that stood me in good stead, because having done that, when I began my second work, which actually was my first published novel, I had that much practice at having written. So from poetry to fiction, and then the last two books of mine have been of non-fiction. So everyone says, have you abandoned fiction? And it isn't that. It's just that that's how the journey has been. So.
But primarily you had wanted to be a poet.
At one time. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe it'll come back one day.
I hope it does. Going on to you quickly, is this working? Yes. So tell us about your journey into writing, and do you really believe that writing is sort of, it is an expression of asserting an identity? So do you feel that it served that purpose for you?
I've been writing for very long. I'm not as young as Shujoy and Tulsi, but I'm much older. So it's I started writing in the 1980s when there was no internet and there were only magazines that you could publish poetry and fiction in. So it's been a long while, but yesterday I was at one of the colleges here, JERC, and the students asked a similar question that, why do you write? My answer to that question is that I write because, I can't use a gun. If I could use a gun, I would have used it. But the next best thing, I think, is to use a pen. And there's a line here in the poem that I read, your pen's are guns. So I think that that's how I feel. I feel that, now if you say, why do you want to use a gun? It's obvious that the obvious answer to that is that I'm completely unhappy with the way the world is. Given who I am, which I don't need to rub in at this point, but given who I am, I'm unhappy with the way the world is. I always have been. And it's not going to change through persuasion and so on. So the only way to change it then is to, shoot people and mow them down, and and I think that the pen can do that very effectively. if you wield it in a certain way. So that's why I write.
Thank you. Should we do a little more of reading and then come back to...
Should I start? Okay, there are two things that I'll leave it up to you guys. There's one part where Ananda Sen, who's the principal protagonist, reaches a sort of psychic epiphany. I could read that out, or I could read out a section where he discovers that he's in love. What would you prefer? Psychic or romance?
Romance.
Psychic.
Psychic.
Okay. So he's out drinking with his love interest, Mithali, and her gang is full of filmy people. Mithali's boyfriend at the time is a music director, and he's gone out to a typical nightclub in Bombay, and he's out drinking, and he's hit a moment. Okay? So there's a lot of... if I read it fast enough, I can cover the entire thing. I turned my new hypervision eyes to look at Danny. Oh, he'd never break into Bollywood. Even this movie would get into trouble with star dates and releases. I looked at Danny's friends from the movie business. I saw their small petty lives, their homes in modern chawls and shared one-bedroom houses. They lived on the money they earned at photo shoots and edit rooms. I felt their futures too, nothing exceptional. I was nudged by the waiter and I felt his family back in the boondocks of Jaunpur, an aging mum, a young bride, younger brothers, one of who wanted to sleep with or had slept with his wife. I looked at the bartender. I sensed his family living not far away from this place, a daughter he wanted to educate, a son he hadn't wanted in the first place. I sensed his wife doing 2 jobs a day, trying so hard to move up the class structure. I looked at Ruma of the doe eyes and the nearly cute petite frame, and I felt a boyfriend in the near future, someone she didn't care for much but needed for social credibility. I sensed a promotion at work and her vying for a job with someone else. The world was calm, quiet. What peaked were people's individual energies, the 1 or 2 things that were unique to them. While I had probably sensed the effects of this very phenomenon all these years, this was the first time it was so manifestly clear. Everyone was energy. Since you can't help but receive energy, you feel their energy. If your mind and your internal sensing organ are up to it, that energy can be read, felt, transformed through cards and charts and other devices. It's essentially energy resonating with energy. All the so-called psychic gifts are just variations of the same resonance, mutations that the resonance undergoes when being interpreted, like a ripple in water, time and a clock, like a piece of iron that slowly gets magnetized, like light and silver nitride, like hydrogen and helium, like all of these, and yet with meaning, with life, with a plan, a path. I started seeing with more than just my eyes. I saw how the energy shaped their beings, their bodies. I saw how a girl in a filmy group who'd started working very early in life had turned more masculine in the placement of eyes. They were closer set than most women, smaller and predatorial. I saw how insecurity spoke in just the tiniest misalignment of the shoulders. So that's why they called it a chip on the shoulder. I saw how differences with the parents over the choice of one's girlfriend showed in a stiffness that ran from the chest through to the arms. I saw how ambition made the brow curl. I saw how horniness dilated the eyes, how envy was a vacuum that sucked from the heart, how happiness lifted the spine, how love clothed one in an aura. I could see the swirling balls of energy that we call humans, this emotional, flickering waveform that each person was. Some bluish, some orange, some shone with a white radiance and intellectual brilliance, some with a healing greenish light. Mithali, of course, was golden.
Does this work? No, you can. No, that's fine. This book is very special to me because it's my father's book, but my father passed away in 2010, and this book came out now in 2016. So it also tells me that if you have good writing, that doesn't die, and the work that you do, it sort of lives on. In his lifetime, my father worked on Indian philosophy. That was his chief passion in life. He was an IAS officer, but not a very good bureaucrat. He filed cases against the government of India, which didn't make them very pleased with him. But in the area of philosophy, his contribution was solid and immense, I would say. Central to it was the idea that dharma is what the Indian civilization is about. So there really is no Hinduism, because such a thing doesn't exist, but it is dharma that's the foundation of our civilization, and therefore we are a dharmic civilization. And when we see things in that context, it also helps understand our own selves. So identity and the relationship of the self and the other are sort of understood better through the prism of dharma than by a term Hinduism that really we didn't use for ourselves. Because I'm here in Jaipur, I'd like to read from a passage on Jainism, the Jaina view of life, chiefly aparigraha, which means not grasping. So thrilled to be reading from my father's work at Jaipur. Aparigraha, or non-grasping, is an idea as central to Jainism as Jainism is central to human order. Far from being just moralistic and therefore empty, it makes the very foundation of all relationships, personal and collective, at once empirical and spiritual. But is it a negative idea of denial, although that is what it may appear to be, for the word in Sanskrit and not in English as prefix to this word? Once we understand that parigraha, what it is, we will clearly see how very positive aparigraha is as an attitude, as a state of mind, and thus of conduct. The Sanskrit word parigraha means to take hold of, to grasp, to surround, to encircle, to grasp, to clutch, to take possession of, to overpower, to take prisoner, to conquer. And that's what we mostly do in a great many of our relationships. We take hold of the other, we surround, encircle, we grasp, we take possession of, we overpower the other. For wanting to conquer, we imprison the other. This is done not in personal relationships alone. It has been practiced for countless centuries by one group of nations towards another group, and by one nation towards another. Often crudely, but quite as often subtly, parigraha has been used universally. Some even, I'm sorry, the light is just a bit, some even raised it, as they do now, as a sort of art, but crude or subtle, it has always been a state of violence.
This is a poem called Bed and Breakfast. Checking into a bed and breakfast, we collected our keys and went to our room with a view of the sea. Though it was a double room, the beds were disjoined. We marched back to the lobby to ask for a room with conjoined beds. Those are given to couples, the manager said. We are a couple, we protested. The manager thrust a dictionary into our hands that defined a couple as a man and a woman. I'm a woman, my friend said. He had shoulder-length hair and a girly walk and wore earrings. He even offered to undress. But the manager was a walnut. All hotels being full, we went back to our room with the disjoined beds. In the veranda, a sparrow had given birth to chirpy chicks. Ships waited to birth. It's not over. We showered, ordered fried fish and wine. As evening came, we joined our beds, getting rid of the wooden side table placed between them. We smoked a joint, then cuddled up and switched off the lights. A midnight knock. We opened the door. It was the manager asking us to leave. "What's our crime?" we asked. But he pushed us out the front door, flinging our backpacks behind us. "Faggots," he spat and violently slammed the door.
Thank you so much for that. Before we move on to audience questions, I think we still have about 5 minutes for that. Should we just, since we do have a theme here, if we could just maybe talk about that and I get your thoughts on.
I think they're very different.
Yeah, and I understand that, but I think that's why it's important to sort of hear each of your sort of perspective on it.
Yeah, I think we can do it in reverse.
No, as I said that, these are not just these poems, but everything that I've done so far is intended to give offense. But also on a more serious note, there's a certain kind of aesthetic that I'm concerned with. There is writing that you may call mainstream writing, okay? Mainstream fiction, mainstream poetry. But then in literature departments, we use the word marginal. And there is marginal literature as well. Now, I think that the main categories of marginal literature would be women's writing, of course, and Dalit writing. But then after that, gay writing is certainly also a part of marginal literature. Marginal because it's not mainstream. But then just because it's not mainstream is not enough to qualify it as marginal. And I think that marginal literatures must develop their own aesthetic, which cannot be the aesthetics of mainstream writing. And for me, a queer aesthetic is first of all to move away from decorous language and read poems like this in front of respectable middle-class audiences, certainly with a view to shock them. So I'm not denying or hiding the fact that my intention is to shock. If I don't know, when you read, everything doesn't come across to an audience. But there were words which you wouldn't use, which would need asterisks or something. But I wouldn't do that. I would go out of my way to use those words. And this is how one develops an aesthetic. I think that particularly with gay writing, the borderline between what you might call porn and then non-porn is and should be obfuscated. You can't have that category of pornography and non-pornographic writing. So that's one. There are other things about the queer aesthetic. But I think that I'll just leave you with this point, and we can take it up if there are students here who want to talk about it, that marginal literatures do need their own aesthetic. You know that the feminists have been talking about mainstream writing as being phallocentric and so on. And so they're trying to, they've moved away from that. Dalit writing also is very different from Brahminical writing, because it's again very raw, it's very angry, it's usually in the first person. It can even be abusive if you know the work of some Marathi Dalit poet, because I live in Maharashtra, like Namdev Dasal and so on. It can be very, positively abusive. Namdev Dasal has a poem called Gandu Bagicha. Now, you wouldn't think of using a word like Gandu in serious literature, but he does it. So that's what I mean, that, we have to move towards an alternative aesthetic, which is how these poems and other things that I've written need to be seen.
Do you believe that do you also believe that to be a part of that, say, genre of writing, you would need to belong to that sort of community? Because there is a lot of debate about, people entering the community, but then sort of that's not seen as representative, for example.
That's a very good question. Do you need to be an insider or an outsider? Now, my view, again, this is an unconventional view, is that you do need to be an insider. Now, that violates the idea of freedom of speech, because you might say, well, I'm not a Dalit, but that doesn't mean I can't. Mulk Raj Anand wrote Untouchable. And a woman, a man might say, I'm not a woman, but so what? I can have strong women protagonists, But that's easier said than done. And I think we live in times where marginal groups have found their own voice, and those who are outside those margins can never approximate the same voice. So I think that this is a sort of rigid view, but I don't think, for example, that any heterosexual writer anywhere in the world has been able to depict gay protagonists the way, gay writers like Jean Genet or Oscar Wilde or Ismat Chugtai would be able to do. And therefore, that's as I said, it's not a popular view, because you can immediately hit back and say that, what about freedom of expression? Because I talk about censorship and self-censorship. You mentioned that. I wanted to say that not only censorship, but today I think we are living in times where one would think twice. I uploaded some of these poems. There's one called National Anthem. I uploaded some of them on my FB page, withdrew them the next day because I had a sleepless night. I said, what might happen? You know what happens? I mean, every other day, something or the other happens. If nothing has happened so far, it's just good luck. Ramchandra Guha once said that if you write in English, you're relatively safe, because, all the lumpen elements who create trouble don't read English. There are enough?
Facebook trolls.
Yes. So one is just
social
lucky.
Media vigilantes.
Yes, absolutely. So one is just lucky, but I think that every time you do something, you're in doubt. That should I do this or should I not? It was never so bad before, but it certainly is now. And so that's the context in which these things need to be seen.
Shujai, should I move on to you and just ask you, since you're back to the advertising world now, I wanted to ask you what the switch has been like.
I'll just continue from
Sure. Go ahead.
From the theme, because I think it's a strong point. I think I belong to the mainstream, and unfortunately, I think I'm conditioned by the world that I came from, advertising. And my personal stance on this is persuasion and not, taking a hard stance and shocking. So I believe in the meaty churi, the subtle knife, so to say. And I think I've tried to do that with my novel. So I don't know if you got a sense of that, but some of the other sections that I'd bookmarked were not quite intense. They're a little funnier, one hopes. And I believe that questions of identity, unless you're sort of marking your ground, they are questions rather than answers. And I think that my book is, again, about questions. It's about persuasions. It's about what you believe, about what stories you believe. And I believe that the times we live in, not to look at laws which are outdated or shouldn't have been in the first place, but these are times where the more compelling story seems to win. It certainly it can win for good, or it can win to do tragic harm to others. And so, yeah, I believe sort of willy-nilly I'm on the side of the mainstream. I believe in persuasion. I believe that the mainstream is not particularly thought through in a lot of English writing in India. In the languages, perhaps it does better. So my attempt really with my novel has been to make the mainstream a little more thinking.
Would you like to sort of comment?
I actually have a question related to what you said, and I was just wondering why, and it's to us to learn, why you felt that in gay literature particularly, the borderline between pornography and non-pornographic material, was closed, because, after all, it's also about relationships, and it's also about two human beings. So why why should the act alone define that kind of writing? Why, I'm sure there's a larger dimension to the gay identity. So I was just interested by that comment of yours and whether you'd like to expand.
If I have understood you rightly, the difference is between love and lust. So I think love is the prerogative of heterosexual people, because you have an infrastructure, you have institutions like marriage. With illicit love, which is what homosexuality is in India, it has to be touch and go, So there's no question, there's no chance for love to develop. It's one night stands, it's, somebody you meet somewhere and before the person disappears, you make what you can of that opportunity. And therefore, the emphasis is on the body. It's not so much on feeling. Feelings take time to develop. They're not, in India today, there are not that many gay couples. There may be now among the new generation and so on. But it's still not the same as a heterosexual couple. During my time, it was, and a lot of that, there's a short film called Bomb Gay. I don't think anyone here has heard of it. It was made by Riyad Wadia, who was a gay filmmaker who died of AIDS in 2003. It's just an 11-minute short. And it's not even on YouTube or anything. It's not even on YouTube or anything. But there are images there of what is called washroom sex, because in the 80s and 90s, before the internet, one of the strongest networking places was these public washrooms or urinals in train stations and so on. Now you can imagine how sordid that is, because that is associated not just with, on the one hand, there's excitement and lust and pleasure and all that. But on the other hand, there is a threat from the cops, from hoodlums, who take advantage of it and then blackmail you, beat you up. So there's a lot of that imagery that recurs in my work. Not just in my work, there's a filmmaker called Onir in Bombay, and he made a film called I Am. And one of the vignettes in I Am, which features Rahul Bose, and Rahul Bose was also in Bombay, is exactly about this, that he picks someone up in a washroom and then the person goes along with him for a while, but he's actually an agent provocateur, and then he sort of assaults him and robs him and so on. So in such a scenario, to return to your question, there's no question of love developing. And I think that when you're writing, the aesthetic that I spoke of must reflect that. You can't live in a make-believe world where you say, oh, so these are... My critics tell me that, why don't you write a story with a happy ending or a romantic ending? But that can't happen because that's not how it is out there.
Should we move on to, do we have some more time? Yeah, I think we should open it up to the audience now. Please identify yourselves when you, before the question, and let's just keep it to question. And if there's any particular panelist you want to address, just mention that.
Hello? Yeah, can you hear me now?
Please bring it closer.
Hello, yeah. Hi, my name is Satish Disa, and my question is addressed to Sujoy. When you're reading the book, so I was just confused whether it's the entire book is a philosophical book, a romantic book, or is it about the occult? No, I found it very interesting, but is there some place, because the whole question of identity comes from, how we can kind of pigeonhole ourselves into saying it's like, okay, here. So in that conversation, I was just wondering about your book. Is it possible to pigeonhole it into certain section?
I hope not. When I was writing out the query letters for my novel, and my wife read it, she said, this is just not what the book is about. So I'm not sure. For me, the book is about beliefs. So it is about, and it's about what you believe about yourself. So when I gave it to the publisher, one of them said, but it's actually a psychological thriller. So yes, it's about the psychic. It's about a family of psychics. It's about philosophy. It's about what you believe, and there is a psychological thriller plot to it. But for me, the purity of it, the reason I wanted to write it is because it's a book about beliefs. More specifically, a book about what story we've told ourselves.
Just one more question for all the three panelists.
We'll come back if there's more time. We'll move on to.
Hi, I was just wondering, my name is Mridul Bhasin, and I wish to address my question to Mr. Rajarao. I was just wondering, as a reader, as you mature as a writer, doesn't the compulsion to write about something, write about your personal sexual experiences, doesn't it wane? Because you're a sensitive person as a writer, and you live in a world around you, you have a world. So why there is such an obsessive compulsion about writing about your experiences which don't seem very happy?
Like I said, this work comes from anger. This work comes from a sense of injustice. It's not intended to be happy because one is not a happy person. One can't be, given the circumstances in which we live. And and I'm also not a social or sociable person. So I think I'm getting your point that, after reading this, how can you move about in society? And let me tell you that I've been a professor for 30 years at the University of Pune. You deal with students who are, though they are PG, postgraduate students and research students, but still they're students. And in India, there is the whole guru and shishya tradition. You're supposed to shape the morals and everything of your students, whereas I'm encouraging them to be moral. So all that is not easy, but it's something that one has thought out long ago when one started writing, that this is the literary persona that I'm going, sorry, I keep forgetting. This is the literary persona that I'm going to take on or adopt, come what may, with the result that, as I said, this calls for a certain degree of reclusivity as well. In the gatherings like this, and this year somehow there were a lot of lit fests I went to, starting with Shillong, Pune, Goa, Hyderabad, and now here, and there may be some more. But I'm never in my element. When we sit and chat and writers say, so what have you published? That sort of talk I can't do. So it's not nice. It seemed impolite. But I think that it's all coming from this. The starting point is simply this, to cut a long story short, is that as you're growing up, when you find that you're not like everybody else, I'm not attracted to the opposite sex at all. Whereas to my own sex, there are very strong, lustful feelings which have always been there. What do you do when you move about in a world where you're inundated with heterosexual images in Bollywood, in advertising, and everywhere? The whole talk is so normative and heteronormative that you're bound to feel either you sort of stay. The mic doesn't like what I'm saying. Either you stay in the closet and lead a life of depression and all that, or you say, what the hell, I have a right to be who I am. But then this is how it sort of unfolds itself through the writing and through the kind of lifestyle that one lives. I didn't get her.
The other side, what about accepting the other side?
The other side.
That also is an existence.
The other side doesn't accept us. The Supreme Court, recriminalize homosexuality, although the Delhi High Court had given us a judgment in our favor, because they thought that Indian society is on their side. And that if you went with a mic and asked people, say people in this room, what do you think of homosexuality? For reasons of political correctness, some people might say it's okay. But a lot of, even young people will say, yuck, it's disgusting, and how can they? And Wendell Roderick's my friend, he does a very nice thing in forums like this. The first thing he says is, how many of you have seen a homosexual person? And then there's pin drop silence. And then he stands up and says, look, I am a homosexual person. See me. And then at least you can say, I've seen one homosexual person. So, it's things like that. It's a war. It's two sides. Just as there are gender wars, I think there are sexuality wars as well. Gender wars we've understood. The polarization between the genders is, that's firmly established. Caste wars we've understood. But this is one war that, because it has to do with sex and morality, it's not fully understood.
Should we just go to the back ones? Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir.
Could you stand up? I can't see you here.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I have a question.
Who is the question for? Sorry. Okay. It's you.
What theme you have taken for your novels, and why have you taken those themes? What message you want to give us?
There is no message, because messages have to do with preaching. I just want to return to the word shock. I want to make you uncomfortable. I want to disturb you and leave you with that. I have no message. By extension, you can form a message. I just want to disturb you, because I'm disturbed by you, not you, I'm disturbed by society, so I want to disturb them in return. It's revenge. Writing is revenge.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Frano Kršanić, and I have a question. Do any of the members of the panel have something to say about identity politics?
Identity politics? In any particular context, or? Yeah, it's quite a. Because we've been discussing many aspects of identity politics. So
What form does it take in India? I live in Europe, so I'm quite aware of what's happening in that respect in Europe, but I don't really know what the forms might be here in India. But if it's too broad a question, I'll be happy to pass the microphone to somebody else.
You mean different forms of identity politics in India? Yeah?
I think the main forms of identity politics in India are not very different from Europe. They have to do with religion and class and caste and gender, as well as sexual orientation. But what happens is that the older categories subsume the later categories. And so certain things like sexuality are completely subsumed by larger questions of class and caste and gender. So we are moving in the same direction as you in Europe.
You could add statehood and ethnicity and things like that.
Yeah,
but
animal rights and
so perhaps
things like that.
there are some wars that we're fighting which are the same, and there are some wars which are slightly more nuanced. What is masculinity in India is a different answer or a different discussion than perhaps what's masculinity in Europe. So it is a very wide. We could take over the next session if we had to get into.
Well, let me ask a more specific question then. In Europe, I'll give you a specific example. In Europe, Scotland had its independence referendum. Well, that was the kind of identity politics you haven't mentioned when you gave me your answer. Catalonia is about to have a referendum on its nation's independence. So my specific question to do with India, are these kind of identity politics at play?
Of course, there's the question of Kashmir.
If there's one thing if there's one thing we pride ourselves in India, it's the fact that despite great variety in India and the absolute freedom to either believe, not believe, to faith in different gods, there is a sense of unity, although India as an idea came about, when we became a republic in 47. But when you talk about Scotland, we've had some movements, like at one time, perhaps in Punjab, there was some kind of a movement towards, moving out of the unity of the Union of States. But somehow it always comes back, thankfully, that we really haven't had someone breaking away. And that's also because if you take caste as a factor, that's something that exists, but then there's always religion. There are other factors that hold us together. So as you were saying, some battles are common and then some aren't. So you can't split, the split isn't very clean in those cases.
Sir, I think that the Kashmir issue is comparable to what you said, but there are authors here from Kashmir who are right here at this festival, and I'd like to introduce you to them, and they'll give you a better view on these.
Sir, my name is Gautam Vigda, and you have talked about the lit theatre, the lit literature. So, how do you think? So, do you think that mainstream writer can feel, can think, and can write that in the same way the Dalit writer writes?
I think he already answered that question, though.
So, Dalit writers are still writing. So, do you think that the oppression and the suffering of Dalit is still exists?
That's a different question. Are you saying that does the oppression still exist?
Yeah. On the Dalits.
Is the question that does the oppression on Dalits still exist?
The oppression remedied. Of course. If the day oppression ends, we've arrived in utopia. But utopias are not reachable places. So, of course, the oppression continues, the struggle, the fight must continue, the writing must go on, in the hope that we will reach our respective utopias, but that will not happen.
I just want to add to the point that you were making about writing, without necessarily being what you write about. So Stephen King was once asked about his film, and he said that, you've written so compellingly about being held hostage by a fan. Have you ever been held hostage? And he said, yes, I was held hostage by cocaine for many years. So it's how you look at it.
Hi, my name is Isra, and my question is to Shujai Datta. I'm in advertising, and I'm a writer. And my question is that when you're working in an advertising firm, your creative process is very different from when you write individually or create anything, be it art. Creative processes outside of advertising are very liberating because you don't have anything to meet except your own expectations. So when you travel out of that world and achieve that sense of liberation of putting out a book, and then you go back to that world, how do you feel as a creative person? Do you feel like you're further limited? Do you feel like you've gone out and come back? Or do you feel like you've expanded your world as a creative?
Both. You feel like you've left one jail and joined another jail, because writing is not particularly liberating. In an advertising agency, there are people to hold the gun and a deadline, and that sort of helps you produce work. When you're writing alone, you're holding that gun, and it's not easy to hold that gun. So it's not particularly liberating. Equally, both are gardens. In an advertising agency, you're surrounded by images, impressions, some of the best ideas from all over the world. You're talking to very bright people every day. So there is a deluge of input, which is fascinating. When you're working alone, you have the time to think, you have the time to read. So it is a garden. So I would say, yeah, It was like going from one jail to another, and it was going from one garden to another.
Can I just add to that? Shujoy, I think Salman Rushdie has said many times that his work in advertising was the sort of training ground for him before he wrote Grimace, which is his very first novel. I think that in advertising, copywriting is, one thing that is creative and so on. Of course, there are other things like deadlines and so on. But a lot of writers, would say that their creativity, the training ground or the breeding ground for that creativity was when you had to write jingles and advertising copy and so on. So there's the good side to it as well.
Just because you're in advertising, and advertising forces you to be versatile. You have to write in many different voices and for many different brands and say many different things. And I think that's great training ground before you find your voice. You should write in multiple voices, read multiple voices. Same. The process is so different. It's like saying, if you were a football player and you were a writer, how is the creativity different? In one case, you are being creative. You're dribbling the ball, or you're anticipating the opponent's move, and so maybe there are parts of your brain, but they're different. They're fundamentally different. So yeah, you do have to transition.
It seems to me the ends are different, and that defines a creative process. So perhaps in advertising, it's a job. He has to deliver at some point. There's a deadline. Whereas writing, there is that space that you have time. Of course, there are deadlines, but it's still something that you negotiate.
I think the fundamental difference is that of self-imposed discipline and an organizational imposed discipline, and that changes the creative process.
Writers have been police officers and medical practitioners.
Thank you so much. I think we'll have to wrap up the session now. But thank you all for sharing your thoughts and writing. Thank you for listening. And I hope you all will read more of their writing now. Thank you.
With this, we come to the end of the session, and a little token of appreciation from our side. We thank our wonderful audience today. The next session here at Mahindra Humanities Center, Durbar, is from 12:25 to 1:25. It's Bernini's beloved Love in Renaissance Rome. Sarah McPhee in conversation with James Cuno, presented by Getty Foundation.
गुड़गांव से बेटी के दिल ने उड़ान भरी। गुवाहाटी में आवाज आई,
Baba, Ma, booked your tickets to Goa. Enjoy the beach. Love you.
तुम भी तो आ रही हो। बैग्स कौन उठाएगा? Love you too.
जब से कोटक ने फोन में घर बनाया, तब से अपनों की शरारतों ने उड़ान भरी। गुड़गांव से गुवाहाटी तक फोन फोन में कोटक, कोना कोना कोटक।
Rambagh Palace, Jaipur. One of the best heritage hotels in India with the opulence of an era gone by. Hosts of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival's exclusive opening dinner. And a long-established hotel partner providing a home away from home for some of the world's greatest writers and thinkers. Rambagh Palace, a jewel of Jaipur.
मीरा को राजस्थान कुछ ऐसा दिखा।
Humanities makes us ask the big questions. What's it all about? What's the purpose of life?
What does it mean to lose someone? What is loss about?
Nature of the human being, guilt and innocence.
It's like the pulsating brain of the universe.
More than a place, it's a spirit of inquiry.
Major intellectual crossroads of the universe.
There's a sense of curiosity, excitement.
Issues that won't stay still in one
The
discipline.
Humanities Center is really the beating heart of this university.
Every day is a journey that takes us places, a journey that keeps you on the move. This everyday journey, what does it bring us? Hopes and dreams for a better tomorrow, the power to form connections forever. Because the journey is just as important as the destination.
Makes us ask the big questions. What's it all about? What's the purpose of life?
What does it mean to lose someone? What is loss?
We're going to be starting really shortly. Can I just remind everybody to put their phones on silent?
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 9th Jaipur Literature Festival at Mahindra Humanities Centre Durbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce a session, Bernini's Beloved, and supported and sponsored by Getty Foundation. Request before we begin mobiles to be on, and no flash photography allowed, please. We're happy to announce our next session, that is Bernini's Beloved, with Sarah McPhee in conversation with James Kilmer. Most welcome.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Sarah McPhee is the professor of art and architectural history at Emory University and the author of Bernini and the Bell Towers, as well as Bernini's Beloved, a portrait of Costanza Piccolomini, the book that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk, or a question and answer, for a bit of time, and then we're going to have question and answer with you for a bit of time. Hello, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be with you. Bless you. The setting couldn't be more appropriate for our conversation. While it's not exactly Baroque in time, it's Baroque in splendor.
Certainly.
So that puts us in the mood for the questions we're going to be talking about. So the opening of your book on Bernini's Beloved is like the opening of a police thriller. Give us the opening scene once again.
Okay. Well, it comes from a single document in the archives in Florence, and it basically recounts the tale of Bernini's beloved, this woman here, who is involved with Bernini. She is the wife of a sculptor who works for Bernini at St. Peter's, carving angels for tombs and so forth. And the book opens with a dramatic scene in which Bernini discovers that his younger brother is coming out of Costanza's house, and that indeed he is sharing his beloved with his brother. And in retribution, he commissions a servant to go to the house with 2 flasks of Greek wine, and then, as she takes them in her hands, to slash her face. So that's how the book opens, and this is from the archives in Florence.
It's a terrific opening for the book. It leaves you wanting more instantly. So we have the young papal-protected Protean artist Bernini having a romantic, and we assume, sexual relationship with the wife of one of his assistants, that sculpturing her in the presence of the most, sculpting her presence in the most engaging and intimate manner, discovering that his brother is also having an affair with her, then hiring this man to slash her face, as we said, to permanently disfigure her, and then moving on to one of European art history's most exalted careers. You couldn't make up that story. And maybe you don't need to. Art making, sexual intimacy, jealousy, and physical retribution aren't uncommon to the history of artists. But how common was it in Renaissance and Baroque Rome?
Slashing?
Well, no, the sort of certainly slashing, we'll get to that in a second, but just the emotional relationships and the sexual relationships, the intertwined relationships that sculptors had with the wives of their assistants or maybe with their models. Or, I mean, this was not uncommon.
Well, what are you thinking of in particular?
Well, the Fornarina.
Oh, okay.
So Raphael,
all right.
for example,
all right.
100
Certainly.
years earlier.
In the realm of painting, yes, the Fornarina, but Raphael was unmarried, so it's a slightly different situation.
It wasn't the same
but
circumstances.
Lots of beloveds out there.
And,
right.
and Titian with the women that he hired as models who were themselves prostitutes in Venice and so forth, right?
Sure.
So there's a long history, or there is at least a history of an intimate relationship between the maker of the object, whatever it might be, and the subject of the object. What about the fact that her presence, the sculpted presence, is so intimate? She's so alive. She's so natural. She's so not exactly undressed, but revealing.
Well,
there's a personal relationship that you can instantly get from this.
Absolutely,
sculpture.
and it was unprecedented at that moment in the history of art to depict a woman who is a known woman, a woman who is alive at the time, in such a way. It's one thing to depict your mistress as Flora, but to depict a woman as a speaking likeness, so you're intending people to recognize who she is. In this state of undress, she wears a chemise that's blown open slightly and reveals one of her breasts, or the upper portion of it. This is quite unusual and doesn't sort of reappear in the history of art until Udon. You know,
100 years later,
yeah,
150 years later, yeah.
Some years later.
Yeah. But then she has her mouth open slightly, so it's that
Yes.
speaking portrait that you go on so well
Right.
to articulate. And she's got her hair, it's kind of naturally pulled back, it's very thick, coarse hair. She looks as if she's available only to him, shall we say. But how did people come to know the sculpture? I mean, eventually it goes into other collections
Yes.
and things, but was it at that moment, until that moment, was it only in his possession, Bernini's possession?
It's known pretty quickly because the slashing makes it...
Before the slashing, let's say, for example. When he makes it, does it stay with him in the
between
studio?
about 1636 and 37. And the slashing takes place in 1638. But it was already known in his studio because the agents for the Duke of Mantovano, for example, write back to say, Francesco Mantovano writes back to his prince to tell him that Bernini has sculpted one of the most extraordinary busts.
And it's so intimate that you can't imagine that he would have given it to her, because it would have been seen by Matteo, her husband, the assistant to Bernini, who would have realized this is just not a likeness of my wife. This is the likeness of a loved woman by her lover, not me.
But it's interesting because Bernini, in all of the portraits he does, and he does a lot of portraits, there's only one that has this status as a private portrait. And yet, it's in marble. For such an intimate portrait, you would expect it to be in paint. You would expect it to be a private thing, but this was intended to last and therefore made public.
Okay, well, let's get to the parties in the story in first Costanza. Tell us about the circumstances of her birth and her life. We know that she is of a papal family herself. In the 15th century, Pius II was her whatever relation he was. But by the time she comes along, she's not born in extraordinary circumstances.
No, not at all. Her father is a staffiere. And what I should say about the portrait is, it's one of Bernini's most spectacular and celebrated portraits for its status as a speaking likeness, a likeness of a woman who seems so vividly portrayed that she's about to speak. Okay? But until we knew nothing about her biography. So what makes a portrait speak is generally what we can reconstruct about who they were, where they're from, what sort of status and so forth. And Costanza did not have a biography. So the décolletage of her chemise and her kind of wild hair and so forth produced all kinds of projections from predominantly male art historians on the subject of Costanza's bust. But yes, indeed, she wasn't even called by her own name, Piccolomini.
Right,
she was
right.
called Bonarelli for her
father
husband.
was a footman.
He was
what
a footman.
exactly is a footman?
Well, it's someone who works in a noble house and basically opens doors and is a staff of a...
So she's 18 years old when she marries, I think. Is that
Yes.
all right?
Mhm.
So how does she get to that point? But what is it? Do we know anything about her childhood or,
We know
or how
very-
she meets Matteo? For
We know
example, her
very
husband?
little. I found her when she was about 11, and she's living in a parish in the center of Rome, and she's living. And then her dowries I find as she makes her way
I'm
into
going to get to the
Matteo's.
dowries in a second,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
because it's such an interesting thing.
Okay.
But when did we think? Let's see, the sculpture is 1638, six.
She's born in about 1614,
Uh-huh.
and she's
So
identified.
she's 22 when the sculpture's made.
Right.
Yeah.
And he 38.
He Bernini,
So,
38.
yes, there's
yeah.
a significant difference in age, whereas the brother is 14 years younger than Bernini, so more age appropriate for Costanza. But so there's very little we know about her childhood, other than that she was born in Viterbo, which is about an hour's drive today north of Rome, and that she comes down to the city quite young and is eligible for these dowries.
Okay, so she does get these two dowries from confraternities. Could you
Right.
tell us a little bit of what a confraternity is?
Sure.
Why she gets dowries? And it was my impression from reading the book that one would get a dowry, a young woman would get a dowry, paid only upon her marriage.
Right.
So it was meant to encourage a woman to get married quickly, as it were.
Right.
And it was a means of controlling perhaps the otherwise sexual license a woman might exploit. Because if she were not married, she wouldn't get these. So it was kind of a bribe in a way. Is that right?
Well, it's there's a phrase in Latin, ex faucibus daemonis, right? So to keep them out of the devil's jaws. So these dowries, the confraternities are religious organizations that are attached to specific churches, and wealthy Romans would leave money to dower young, impoverished maidens in the city to keep them out of the devil's jaws.
Is this something that her father would have sort of set her up for? I mean, how does one get picked to receive a dowry?
Well, you request to be considered.
She
And
herself would
so-
have, or
well,
her father
we don't
on her
have
behalf?
any record of that, but we know that she received two, and we know the institutions, and they were in the area where she was living. One of them, San Rocco, was. But you're right that it exists in, the dowry comes in two parts. The first is the promise of the dowry, and then on completion of the marriage, you bring the marriage certificate, and then the dowry is paid.
Was it substantial? Was it something that was meaningful that she could have lived,
It
she and
is.
Matteo could have
It
lived off?
is. Lived on it entirely, probably not, but he had to present credentials too. The husband had to say, this is how I can maintain the principle of the dowry. It's like an investment. It's like some kind of a bond. You can, it kicks off not a living, but monies, and he has to be able to guarantee the principal. If he can do that, either through a wealthy patron or some other, if he doesn't have the funds himself, then he's able to control the investment and use it as he likes during his lifetime. But upon his death, it reverts to the dowered.
Oh, right. Oh, good. So she's, as it were, held responsible to her husband.
Right.
To maintain that relationship over the course of his life, so she can get the money when he dies.
Precisely.
So she put that dowry at some risk, I would think, by having the affair with Bernini and then with Bernini's brother.
Exactly. However, it is really not unknown in this period for men to loan their wives for professional or pecuniary
Loan,
advancement.
not rent.
Sexually. Yeah, right.
But she marries Matteo. He's about the same age as Bernini, so he's older than she.
He's a bit older, yeah.
Right? Do you have any knowledge about how they met or what circle she moved in that would have gotten her to the artistic circles of Bernini and Matteo?
Well, she lives in a neighborhood, she's growing up in a neighborhood that is identified in one of the dowries as a Manzaneto. It's right behind the Church of San Lorenzo in Lucina in Rome. And Manzaneto is a Spanish name. It actually is a Spanish cardinal. And so I think that she is living nearby Manzanedo's palace. This puts her in the orbit of Spanish patronage in Rome, and Bernini is working in that orbit, and so is Matteo. And Matteo, in fact, goes to work for Bernini in 1636 at St. Peter's. So they marry in 1632, but by 1636, that's how they've met for sure.
So they married in 32, she's 18. Matteo was a bachelor at 38, as we said. How common was it to have an 18-year-old marry a bachelor of 38? And do we assume that it was ever a romantic marriage, or was it only a marriage by convenience?
Can't say. But it was a marriage
Matteo didn't sculpt her
in
a loving way like Bernini.
But it was a marriage that lasted a long time, and very touchingly, I think it must have been a marriage of incredible love from his side, because after the slashing and after her forced imprisonment for the adultery she's committed, right? She's in prison. Bernini's absolved entirely.
He had good patrons.
Yes, he had good patrons. After all of that, he took her. He was not the reason for her being in prison, and he took her back. I found an extraordinary thing in the archives, which was a letter in Costanza's own hand asking the governor of Rome to please release her into her husband's care.
You reproduced that in the book.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, before we get off of that relationship, Bernini, or Matteo Bernini and Costanza, what about Bernini's brother? What was his? What did he do? And what happened to him after the slashing? And I know that he was immediately after the slashing. Bernini was chasing him like a madman and trying to kill him.
Yeah. He was a really odd and interesting character, Luigi Bernini. Bernini had I first became interested in all of this because it was because of the affair that Luigi was exiled for a year to Bologna. And it's when he's exiled...
Luigi, the brother.
Yes. It's when he's exiled to Bologna that the bell tower of St. Peter's begins to develop cracks and leads to he was Bernini's right-hand man and engineer. The Four Rivers Fountain, with its very heavy obelisk in many parts, was put back together by Luigi Bernini. So he works with him throughout his life and lives with him until Bernini's death, and then he dies in the same house the year later.
So if he's the engineer, and if the bell towers are beginning to crack, even if designed by Bernini, are they Luigi's fault? And if so, is Bernini had two blows? One was immediately after the other. One was the affair that his beloved was having with his brother, and then all of a sudden the bell towers are cracking?
He certainly had two blows, no question about that. I mean, the Avisi, the newspapers of the time, say he was near death because it so destroyed him. However, the bell towers were not his fault. This was a lapse in memory at the Fabrica of St. Peter's, as I go into great deal of detail in the first book.
It goes into this book somewhat, as well.
Little.
Well, so 2 years after Costanza and Matteo were married, she's having this affair with Bernini's brother. And we hear of that. I mean, we know of that, of course, and then we hear of his departure for some time, as you say. Does he come back into the picture? Is he at all part of Bernini's working life after that, or any relationship with Costanza? Because they both seem to leave Costanza, Bernini and Bernini's brother, and there's no sort of regret in the sense they don't keep her. She doesn't come back into their lives in any kind of meaningful way.
She does. She lives about 3 minutes from their palace in her house at the foot of the Quirinal Hill. And in fact, later on in her life, when she, I think, is involved with Domenico Salvetti, who is a patron of Bernini's and a good friend of Bernini's, Luigi is designing the garden at the Four Fountains for Domenico Salvetti. So it's a very tiny circle, and they're all still very much together. And in fact, when Matteo dies, it's Bernini who buys the casts for the lions for the King of Spain from his collection, and Costanza sells them. So,
Okay, tell us more about the violent attack on her. How common, well, now we get to that question you were wanting to answer earlier, how common were such attacks? You mentioned Caravaggio as himself being attacked. How common were they, and what were the incriminations for both Bernini and Costanza?
Well, attacks, sfregio, which is what the word in Italian, the slashing, was extremely common in the 17th century for certain kinds of, to make a certain statement. The face was the mirror of honor. Oh, sorry. So the face, when slashed, is forever disfigured, is forever marred. And it is basically something you do in a drunken brawl, like in Caravaggio's case, as some kind of wound, a retribution. But in Costanza's case, it has a very specific meaning, and that is he wants to mark her as a fallen woman, yeah. A dishonored woman, and in fact, really almost like a prostitute, but not really. But he permanently disfigures her, and in fact, in Aretino writes his book Nana about a prostitute who fakes a slashing, the scar from a slashing, in order to set up a client for payment. So it's a terrible crime. It's punishable by death on the books in some cases, but mostly by exile.
Adultery is?
Yeah, no.
Or prostitution?
Adultery and slashing.
Oh, the slashing. So,
yeah.
So the man who slashed her
Precisely.
could have been... Oh,
so I looked for, about 6 months in the tribunal archives in Rome for some kind of case where Bernini would be prosecuted, not realizing that it would be she who is prosecuted for this crime and he who is restored and pardoned. At first,
because he was so powerful, or because
yes, he
was a man?
Because he was a rare and extraordinary artistic genius. And this is for Cellino Cellini is pardoned. Benvenuto Cellini is pardoned for murder. For this, on the same grounds. He's rare. He's indispensable to the papacy.
Does it take a papal pardon? Is that what happens?
A papal pardon. So he's fined 3,000 scudi, which is a tremendous amount of money, and then all of it's forgiven.
Oh, yeah. So he may have been fined 3,000 scudi, but I believe you say in the book that the sculpture itself is valued, as I recall, at about 1,000 scudi, so it's a very valuable work of art.
Right. Huh? I make that statement on the basis of the value of Scipione Borghese, which is the other real speaking likeness from the 1630s, and that's what that's valued at. So yes, it's worth a tremendous amount of money, and 1,000 scudi in the 17th century would keep a nobleman in carriages and his palace for a year.
Okay. So she's walking around the streets ever after with a scar on her face, I suppose.
Yeah.
Right? Would she? How common was that? I mean, would she have run into other women with scars? I have a couple of questions. One of which is that, and how therefore marked was she by that fact, and how embarrassing was it to walk the streets and so forth? I mean, she has a penalty to pay, and she pays that penalty. But would it be clear to others that this was a romantic tryst, or would it be suggested that she was a prostitute? You mentioned that some thought she was. Is there that problem for her for the rest of her life?
Well, in Papal Rome, if you were a fallen woman and you had been publicly marked or accused or imprisoned in one of these houses for badly married women, it pursued you throughout your life. You were required by law to leave 1/3 of your worldly goods, no matter what they rose to the Magdalens, the convent of the Magdalens on the Corso. And the authorities watched carefully to make sure that those monies were left in the will.
That convent served, as it were, fallen women?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. Well, it served reformed prostitutes, but all fallen women who were denounced by neighbors or whatever were on lists and watched year by year, and the archives survive for these institutions.
Had she been a prostitute, would her crime been greater? Would her penalty have been worse?
That's a good question. Probably not. I mean, she certainly wouldn't have been incarcerated as a malmaritata, you know. And your other part of your question was the wound.
For the rest of her life.
Right.
Yeah.
I go into some detail in the book about how do you repair a facial wound in the 17th century, and the Italians are quite good at repairing facial wounds because there was a lot of this going on. Yeah. And in fact, they came up with plastic surgery for replacing noses, which in Sicily were cut off when you had a case of adultery. In any case, they developed a kind of butterfly bandage
you mentioned that in the book,
that could suture the wound and avoid stitches. So we don't know how horrible the scar was.
There aren't other images of her. This is the only image we have of her?
Even, I suggest that there are, we know that there were
you
8
could find her in
paintings,
other
and I find her
sculptures.
twice
Yeah,
in
yeah,
2
yeah.
paintings
Yeah.
that I think I can identify as.
Without scar.
Right, but that wouldn't be there anyway. They would paint it out.
Yeah, okay. And so she was confined to a monastery thereafter for a period of time.
4 months.
And for how long? That's the question. And what was Matteo during those 4 months? I guess maybe at the same time she while in the monastery petitions to the Cardinal Barberini. And what did she petition for? So what happened while she was in the monastery? What happened to Matteo? And why did she petition? And how did she get out?
The petition to Cardinal Barberini comes from Bernini's mother. It's a letter that is basically sent to try to stop the one brother, John Lorenzo, from killing the other brother, Luigi, in the wake of the affair. So that's one of the letters. The other letter, the one penned by Costanza in her own hand, which is quite interesting, because despite her modest origins, she was literate, and that was extremely unusual. That was sent to the Governatore of Rome, who's the head of the whole prison system, asking for release to her husband's care. And she writes, because without food one cannot live. And she's living on the handouts of others.
Yeah. Was the 4 months she was
4
in prison?
months.
Yeah. Was that the extent of her punishment, as it were, or did she get out early because of this petition?
I believe she got out early because of the petition.
Mm-hmm. So what happened to her husband, Matteo, during this period? How did he continue working, and for whom did he work? I would assume, but maybe not, that this affair would have caused bad relations, poor relations between Matteo and Bernini, and he may not have gotten the work from Bernini he once had, and he had to work for somebody else.
Alas, there are gaps in our knowledge, but what does happen is there is a break. He stops working at St. Peter's, and he works for the Germans at Santa Maria dell'Anima. But then he goes back to work for Bernini at St. Peter's, so things heal. And he works for Bernini through until 1654 when he dies.
Mm-hmm. He had paintings, that is, Matteo had quite a collection. Paintings by Poussin, for example. How did he get those paintings? And was Poussin a friend of his? Poussin, contemporary painter, of course, French painter working in Italy, and a very important painter. And you point out the extent to which the paintings themselves were influential in certain sculptural compositions. So what about that relationship, Matteo to Poussin?
Well, I think that Poussin was a friend of Matteo through various connections, because when in the early years, they own quite a lot of Poussins, and by the time that that Matteo dies, Poussin's career is meteoric. And they owned the Plague at Ashdod, which is in the Louvre. They owned the Parnassus, which is in Madrid at the Prado, and then multiple other canvases that are scattered around
Would he have
Italy.
paid full value for them?
No, I think
he would have been a friend.
They were friends. And in fact, there are statements, not specific to them, but how those who knew Poussin in the early years got away with murder, basically, in acquiring his
at an undervalued price, as well.
But Costanza was, after Matteo's death, she goes on to run his sculpture studio, but also to sell the artwork and buy others. Yeah. And one of the things she does is Mazarin, the French prime minister, hopes to buy the Plague at Ashdod, and she says, I'll take 1,000 scudi. And we know that the 1,000 scudi is a year's income for a noble. And he says it's too high. She holds firm and sells it to the Duc de Richelieu the following year.
So we know that Matteo was also good friends with Velázquez. So this is quite a circle of people. I mean, these are two of the greatest painters, Poussin and Velázquez, of the 17th century, one of the greatest sculptors of the 17th century, Bernini. And Matteo's in the middle of that, and therefore Costanza's in the middle of that.
Right.
What is the dynamic of that, all those interrelationships? Are they intimate in the sense that they sit around and have dinners together and drinks together, or is it just professional?
Well, another question that we can only really kind of guess at, but I think that their lives crossed paths on a daily basis, and I think that there were all kinds of negotiations and transactions that were going on. Sitting down to dinner, I don't imagine, but especially after what had transpired. But cordial relations and economic common.
They did business and so forth.
Yeah.
But he was building this collection by purchase and by undervalued purchase
And we should just say it's 111 paintings and 70 sculptures, many of which now form major German collections of sculpture, and the paintings are scattered around the best museums in Europe. So it was a sizable and
important collection.
Yeah.
Matteo dies in 1654, 20 years after marrying Costanza. She inherited this great estate. Do we have a figure for how the value of this estate? Because it was, as I recall, it wasn't just the paintings and sculpture. It was her dressing gowns. It was her bedding, all of which had great value too. Huh?
Well, she loved clothes, and curiously, in the 17th century, clothes had real investment value. And in fact, I think she was selling paintings when she was dying, knowing that she could place the monies in the more stable commodity of clothing. Clothing was inventoried after death in the same way paintings, sculpture, bedding, and so forth were. And the clothes were worth quite a lot of money. But she continued to work after his death and continued to invest in bonds, and so the wealth grew. And by even a conservative estimate, her estate was worth about 15 to 20,000 scudi at the time of her death. But I think that's a really low estimate. It's on the basis of what documents. But everybody has a vested interest in underestimating it.
Since she was so much younger than he and likely would expect to live longer than he, she must have looked out and thought, I've got quite a long life ahead of me at that point, and I've got what I have is the value of this collection and my own personal properties and so forth. Was that enough? She didn't have to work, in other words, because she was, as you say, living off investments. The income that Matteo would have brought from the work that he did was no longer available to her. Was it something that was it something frightening at that point for a woman looking forward, or was she confident because of the wealth that she had that it would last her lifetime?
Well, it's interesting. Women in the 17th century were not permitted to have businesses of their own unless they inherited them from their husbands, and they could have very successful businesses as widows. And she didn't just live off of what she had. She must have felt a certain urgency to make more money because she continued the sculpture studio, and we have receipts where she's supplying reliefs and sculptures. So she kept people working in the courtyard at the house and continued to make money.
So she was in every respect an extraordinary figure.
And she was referred to as Costanza Scultora, which means Costanza Sculptress, because of her role in running the business.
Now she dies 8 years after her husband dies.
Yeah, very early. She's 48.
And she dies 18 years before Bernini dies. So he succeeds her by 18 years. So that's a long-standing relationship post-scarring that they have together with Bernini. How did she die? And was there any contact between Bernini and her after the slashing incident, other than what you suspect because they lived in the same neighborhood and ran into each other? Was there any lingering affection that Bernini had for her, or she for him, that we have any idea of this relationship? Because Bernini eventually does get married, eventually has children, and so. But
well, in fact, Bernini gets married in the wake of the affair. Urban VIII, essentially, the Pope tells him
that's the deal.
Marry.
Yeah.
These intimacies can be intuited through the progress of goods over time. So, what paintings end up in her collection? What objects of Bernini's end up in her collections? She had terracotta sculptures of Bernini. Now, they have an inherent value, but they're also Bernini. There's no scorched earth here. She is keeping these things. And her, the executor of her will and the tutor to her daughter, and she has a daughter a year after Matteo dies. So the parent is an interesting question.
Do we know anything about the father of this child?
I think he's an abbot. His name is Domenico Salvetti, and he's one of the two executors of the will. And he's very close to Bernini. And so your question, I'm circling around that because she is probably very much involved with this abbot who is a close friend of Bernini's, and his collection in turn brings in a wealth of Bernini.
Do we know what happens to this child after her mother dies? Because this child, as you say, is 8, I think, or 6 years old,
Right.
whatever she is, has a long life. And to the collection of Costanza Matteo, they then transfers to the child? I mean, does it linger longer?
The idea is, after paying the Magdalens off, that the executors will sell off the paintings one by one and invest them for the daughter. The daughter's placed in a monastery to be educated in the neighborhood. And we actually know a lot about her because the accountant who's hired to keep track of the entrate and uscite, or the accounts, on
The ins and outs.
The ins and outs. We have it. I found it in the archives. So we know that she had a pet parrot. We know when she had a ruby ring reset, and so forth. All kinds of details. She goes on, is extremely well educated, and marries the accountant to Clement XI's nephew, the Altieri Pope. So it's she does
It works
extremely
out.
well for herself.
Yeah. So we talked earlier about how she had to give, and part of her penance, I think that's what we said,
Yes.
part of her penance, she had to give money to the Magdalens. And we also know that they had paintings of, maybe 5 or so paintings, and the subject of which was
Yes.
Magdalens. And know that she was buried in Santa Maria Maggiore as a rich woman. And so what relationship, first 2 questions, I guess. One question had to do with the relationship to the Magdalens, and this was it significant that they had these paintings because of their past, or just that it was a subject of Baroque painting? And then secondly, how important was it that she got buried in Santa Maria Maggiore?
Okay, great questions. Remind me if I forget that one. But the significance of the Magdalene pictures, I think, is
Tell us about the Magdalene.
I
who
find
she
them,
was.
okay, the Magdalene is, of course, the archetypal fallen woman. She is the woman who loved Christ. She is the woman who was a prostitute, who found Christ and then reformed. So she gives away her worldly finery, and she is the symbol of penance and reformed sin in 17th century Rome for women. So I don't think it's an accident at all that there are multiple Magdalenes in Costanza's house, nor that she has Saint Agatha, who is the patron saint of abused women or women who are preyed upon, nor that she has Susanna and the elders. Susanna, the Old Testament wife, who is preyed upon by 2 old men and is placed in an impossible situation, I think Gian Lorenzo and Luigi, where she has nowhere to go but to either, tell the truth, and she is exonerated. But the thing, talking about the women in the collection, I would be remiss not to mention her sala, which is the most important room in the house, and the paintings she chose to put there. In a noblewoman's house in the 17th century Rome, you would put exemplars of female virtue. Judith, who saved the Bethulian people, right, through cutting off the head of Holofernes, and so forth. So in Costanza's house, she had 4 paintings in the sala, and they sort of run almost like an autobiography. There is Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. There is Susanna, who's preyed upon by older men. There is the Magdalene, the reformed sinner, and there is a portrait of Costanza herself. So I think she lives there for 8 years by herself. She put those paintings on the walls, and they're a kind of an autobiographical cycle for her.
Now, this is an extraordinary story, and there are others who have written about her, that is to write about this sculpture, and who have identified her differently than you. And you have done detailed, hard work in the archives to come up with archive materials that hadn't been seen before and studied before, therefore hadn't been integrated into the life of this woman and the life of this sculpture before. Do you think you got it right?
Well, you read the book.
Yeah, it was fascinating, I must say. I was convinced.
I think portraiture is such an extraordinary form because I think you see often what you know in a portrait. And so the book asks the question, what do you see when you look at her front on with her disheveled hair and her décolletage and so forth? You might see, as Howard Hibbard did, or Vitkover did, a woman from the streets of Rome. You might see hair falling in easy loops and possibly rather dirty strands.
With no necessary relationship to Bernini, just that she was a woman from the streets.
Well, imagining that she has this, all we knew about her was that they had an affair. We didn't know anything about her life. But if you do reconstruct her life, you might look at the back of the sculpture, which was never printed before, and it was never shown from the back. And there you have a very elaborate hair dress that could not have been done alone, and a spit curl down the back of her neck like Venus, and this elegant maidenly maiden's neckline. You see more, you look differently, and you might even imagine that the gaze isn't come hither, but something quite different on the basis of understanding what a terrifically successful and determined woman she was.
Yeah. Now, I want to get to questions in a second, but I have a question still to ask, and that is that you spent a lot of time going through your archives to come up with the material that you had to make the case that you made. How long did it take, first of all? And second, did you always see this as something that would help us understand the importance of this sculpture, or was it to understand also the role that women played in the lives of artists or in their own lives in Rome in the 17th century? How long did it take, and what was your pursuit?
Well, it happened really quite by accident. I was pursuing a biography of Bernini, actually, and I was in Sweden working in archives of one of his students, and I came across an entry in a journal of this student where he'd gone to Florence and seen this bust, and he said, I saw the bust of his most beautiful favorite, and when he tired of her, he slashed her face. Well, we already knew that, and we knew this terrific portrait. But then it went on to say, but when she died incredibly rich and had an enormous catafalque at her death. So you file that away. It's completely at odds with anything anyone ever said about her.
She wasn't from the street.
No. She turns out to have been a Piccolomini, which was also never pointed out. But this subject took me over. I found that bit, and then I found in Paris another bit, and then I got on the plane and went to Rome and found her will. And then, because no one had ever bothered to look for who she was, it came tumbling out in thousands of pages of archival documents reconstructing this woman's life, which was intoxicating to know the subject of a portrait of a completely unknown person. So that's how it came about.
So this is an important book not only for the history of art and the history of Bernini, let's say, but certainly also for the history of women at the time.
Yes, I hope for social history, economic history, and maybe even literary history, because the portrait he produces for her is very much in the realm of the beloved portraits that you started with Titian and Raphael.
Yeah, good. Okay, we have about 15 minutes. I want to give you the opportunity to take up those 15 minutes. Yes, please. I'll try to repeat it. Oh, here it comes. Okay.
Thank you for the beautiful description in the life after the slashing. Can you give me a little bit of a story while the affair was on, before the slashing? As in, how did Costanza impact Bernini's work, or if she did at all, when the affair was going well and there were no disputes prior to the slashing?
That is such a lovely question.
Did you all understand the question? Yeah, okay.
Okay, so you're asking me what we can know about her role in his life before. I think that the best way of knowing the role before is looking into this sculpture, because it encapsulates such an extraordinary passion for this woman. And as I was saying earlier, the bust is unprecedented in its intimacy, and women in the 17th century didn't have their lips open in portraits. This wasn't done, but Venus does. So he's giving her bits of the goddesses in order to infuse her with this intimacy. We don't know much about, we don't have letters, we don't have a way other than the great work of art that he leaves us. And it's the reason we ask any of these questions.
Yes, please, here.
This Ted? About this time or a bit later on, all portraits of courtesans used to have one bare breast or a very suggestive décolletage.
Yeah.
Does this mean the same thing at the time of Bernini, that because he was sculpting her with this décolletage, that he was thinking of her more as a prostitute or more to the point, a courtesan?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. The question is that portraits of courtesans in this and earlier periods are often shown in slight undress, yes? And with a breast showing. And is this significant for Bernini's portrait? And I would say that looking at the example of Titian's portraits, which are often of courtesans as models, but he then makes them into goddesses. I do not think that it's the portrait of the courtesan per se that is in the background, but more the invocation of the goddess.
Another question over here on the right.
Since you said that this book is also relevant to social history, my question is regarding how much agency do you think Costanza had? Because you said it was common for men to loan their wives for affairs at this point in time, and we also know that she has affairs with all sorts of powerful men. I mean, Bernini and the patron.
Just 2 affairs.
Yeah, so does she really have a choice in the affairs, or, I mean, is it just a matter of circumstance? And
These are the maddening questions. And the way I answer that with the book is by giving you the portrait of Susanna and the elders and asking you to consider, is this actually what took place? Because we don't know how willing she was in any of this.
Yes, please.
Hi. My question is it known for a fact that her affair with Bernini started before it started with Luigi, or like, and I would like to know something, maybe a bit more about Luigi's life.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first part of the question, if I understood it correctly, is, are we sure that she was having the affair with Bernini before the affair with Luigi? Okay. Yes, because at least according to the only document we have that talks about that affair directly, it is the circumstances described are the commissioning of the slashing as retribution for the discovery of the betrayal. It is certainly possible that she was carrying on with Luigi before it, but that's not the sequence that this document lays out. And then the second part of the question.
I'd like to know a bit more about Luigi's life, if you could tell me, and like his reaction towards Bernini when he found out that she was at the same time betraying Bernini, or was he in knowledge of the fact even before?
Luigi, as I suggested but didn't finish up with, is quite a character. Luigi was indispensable to Bernini, but Luigi got into trouble constantly. And Luigi's banished to Bologna for this particular event. He's banished to Naples later on when, under the sculpture of the Constantine in St. Peter's, he attacks a young boy and does unspeakable things. Yes. And he's banished, and Bernini has to sculpt the portraits of all of the family members of the reigning pope to get him back. But he does. So Luigi is really ripe for biography.
Or a movie.
Right.
Yes, this first question here, about 4 rows back. Oh, then you. We have 2 hands up, so 1 and then 2.
I was just going to ask you if that is going to be your next project. Luigi.
Luigi. Oh, it's certainly up there.
Yes,
Are
please.
you working on something else at the moment?
I am actually, but it's quite different. I'm working on an old love, which is Roman architecture and cartography. So I'm back in the realm of mapping of the city. But these are maps I've used for years to follow all of these characters around the city. So it's very much the same.
Okay, question here and then also question here.
Well, what I'm curious about is what do we mean by loving? And we're living in the 21st century and we understand more about such things, or we think we do. If Bernini had really loved Constanza, would he have slashed her?
He didn't slash her. He commissioned it.
Well, in effect, I mean, who actually held the knife or whatever? I mean, he was behind it, wasn't he?
Well, I don't know how much you know about Bernini, but he was a fairly difficult character. I mean, really, really difficult. In his biography, the wife that he marries after the affair and so forth, that Urban VIII tells him he must marry, they say that he could not have made her better had he had her sculpted to his taste in wax, so invoking the Pygmalion in Galatea. But the wife was tremendously docile, just bore children, and Bernini could be just a terrifying character. The stories are endless about that. So I do believe that he was thoroughly capable of it, despite the great passion that she...
Okay, one last question.
I just wanted to ask you, you said 2 affairs, but who did she have the baby by, the daughter? Who was the father?
Well, okay, 3, but one is after her marriage has ended, so that's a bit different. So she is, she was what? Widowed. Yeah, she was a widow. Yeah. So it just depends on terminology, I suppose, but you're right, 3 men.
Okay, it's about 1:15, which I think is about the time to end, but if there's a burning question that you can't live without asking. Okay, you can't live without the question. We have more time? Oh, we have more time, sorry. Yeah.
I just wanted to know the reaction.
We couldn't
The
hear that,
reaction
sorry.
of men toward this statue?
The
Slashing.
The slashing. The reaction...
Men.
The reaction of men to the slashing. You mean that other people may have been upset by what they saw, would have blamed Bernini on it or some such thing as that?
In general, when such events happen to women, what was the reaction of men in general?
To the slashing of the woman.
Yes.
I looked and I looked and I looked and I found the letter in her hand from prison. So, I mean, she was, in his biographies, she is erased. In the principal biography, Baldinucci's Life of Bernini, she is a modifying clause. She is, when they talk about Matteo, they say, husband of that Costanza. That's it. And in the other Life of Bernini, she is the youthful passion, and there's no, he does some terrible thing to her, but is absolved as a rare man. So it is normalized. We have no record of any kind of response that is negative.
Yes, please.
Except for her, to her.
I'd love to know more about Bernini's monstrousness. Why I was not surprised that he was capable of doing that.
Well...
Because there's such delicacy in the work, there's such finesse. He's not a brute.
He's not a brute. No, but he's impossible. Well, I mean, I think the principal thing that he does that makes you, takes your breath away is certainly the slashing. But in all of his, in all of the things that have been written about him in lives and so forth, in his biographies, he is, absolutely, just impossible to, it's impossible to contradict him or to discuss anything with him if not on his terms. He's just not limber, not easy to negotiate with. But there is no other example of such radical behavior.
Yes, please. Here with the hand raised over here on the right, yeah.
I think so. Yeah, very much so. I think that's part of...
Did you hear the question?
Could Costanza be considered a muse?
Question.
Right.
A muse.
But the point of the book in some part was that's all she was considered to some degree: model, mistress, muse. And I wanted to put her back in the realm of the beloved, because the tour de force he creates in sculpture, which is revolutionary in portraits of women in stone, which is a very, permanent medium, is created by this this almost redefinition of what she is. She's a portrait of a living woman, but she's also the muse, the Venus, the beloved. If she was just
a model. If she was just considered a model, she may not have raised the passion in Bernini. If she was a muse and he considered a betrayal, that would raise his passion. So
that's nice.
That's my question. Sorry.
Yeah.
I just one question. Where is the bust now?
The bust is in the Bargello Museum in Florence, up on the 4th floor among Medici medals. Yeah.
Yes, please. Sorry, right around the corner. No, right here. Block with this. Yeah.
Bernini's relationship with her.
We can't hear.
How was Bernini's relationship with her, like before the slashing?
We had that question, I think, a little time ago.
I did not hear it.
And we don't know a whole lot about it. We have to speculate. It could have been a case of, there are odd circumstances. She's involved with Bernini, then she's also involved with his brother. Is this willing? Is this desired on her part? Or is she being loaned by her husband? We don't know exactly. But she leaves us clues, and we can either take those and write it one way or take them and write it another.
You say it again.
The relationship, he took her back after she was
the husband.
The husband, but with Bernini, was there any relationship?
I'm sorry.
With Bernini, was there any meaningful relationship after the slashing?
After the slashing.
Yeah, did she and Bernini continue a relationship of any kind after?
Well, they continued to know one another for sure, because there are dealings between the husband and Costanza's working side by side with her husband. So they are definitely dealing with one another. The nature of those dealings, I don't have letters. I don't have anything that I could tell you concretely, except that they are very much in touch, and that if you measure the amount of time it takes you to walk from Bernini's Palazzo in Via della Mercede to her house in Vicolo Scanderbeg, it's 3 minutes.
Yes, please, right here on the
Rome was
on the end.
tiny.
Madam, Bernini was forgiven by the papacy.
Yes.
But did he have to face something on the social front, or was something like slashing acceptable socially at that time?
I'm not quite understanding.
Did he have to pay a penalty? It was socially, he was exonerated legally, but socially was he
I have found no evidence of any penalty at all. There is initially a fine of 3,000 scudi, which is huge, but then Urban VIII absolves him with praise, saying he's a rare man who's indispensable to the papacy. And so his crime...
There's no social stigma
no,
attached.
None whatsoever. She disappears until she, is taken back by her husband, and then she makes her way forward.
Here on the right.
Oh.
You have to tell me when to stop.
Hi, I just wanted to know that in the possibility that Costanza's involvement with Bernini and Luigi wasn't willing, then when Bernini found out about the affair with Luigi, why was his entire rage directed towards Costanza instead of her husband or Luigi?
I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. No, I'm. Oh, you can hear me, right? Yeah. So, why was his entire rage directed towards Costanza or Luigi? Sorry. Why was his entire rage directed towards Costanza instead of Luigi or her husband?
Why did Bernini have her attacked, not Luigi? Why? He goes after Luigi. You might explain that.
Because there is a possibility that she wasn't willing.
Right. He goes after both of them. Bernini. He sends the servant to slash her face, and then he tries. There we go. There's another instance of his passion. He tries to kill his brother. He runs into St. Peter's after him, where they're both working. He beats him with an iron rod, and then he chases him into Santa Maria Maggiore, kicking at the doors. So he's after both of them.
Yeah, one more question. Oh,
Hi.
here we go.
Okay, my question is, was Costanza's child...
Was the child affected by the slashing? That's an interesting... in terms of status and life experience, no. But emotionally, I mean, who knows? I'm sure the story carried with it a great deal of baggage, especially since after her mother's death, a third of her worldly goods had to be paid to the Magdalens on the Via del Corso because her mother was a publicly fallen woman. So it's inevitable that it affected her, but it did not affect her ability to thrive as a noble in Rome in the 18th century.
as well?
Specifically?
Did society look down upon her as well because of her mother's fallen status?
On the daughter, look down on the daughter as well.
No, there's no, she was able to marry extraordinarily well, and she lived very well, and there's no evidence for that.
Okay, we have to break it off. Please, ladies and gentlemen, Sarah McPhee.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for a wonderful session, and we have a little token of appreciation. And we also thank our sponsors, the Getty Foundation, for this session. Authors will be taken in the book signing area. Books are also available at